Hello, Mike. Are you there? morning, councillors, officers, members of the public and press. Oh, no, we'll start again. Okay, good morning, councillors, officers, members of the public and press. Welcome to this meeting of the Finance and Policy Committee. This meeting is a remote meeting being live streamed on the website and is being recorded. I'll now hand over to David Cosgrove from Democratic Services team.
Good morning, members. Thank you, Chair. We'll begin the meeting by way of a roll call of all those in attendance remotely, and may I request that members confirm they have a paper copy of the agenda, both sections, and that they can both hear and see councillors in the meeting. So I'll start the roll call with Councillor Christopher Akers-Belcher.
Yes, I've got both sets of papers I can see and hear everyone.
Thank you. Councillor Brewer.
Hello, and yes to everything.
Thank you. Councillor Brown.
Yes, I've got both sets of papers and can see and hear everything.
Thank you. Councillor Harrison. No. Okay. Councillor Lindridge.
Morning. Both sets of papers can see and hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Little.
Yes, I'm here and I've got both sets of papers.
Councillor Marshall.
I think Anne dipped out. She dipped out, didn't she, David? I think she went to try and sort her computer out.
Okay.
So, okay.
I can see her on screen. Councillor Moore.
Present, and I have all the correct paperwork.
Councillor Smith.
Present, and I've got all of the paperwork.
Thank you. Councillor Tennant.
Present, and I have all the paperwork and I can see and hear everybody.
Thank you, John. And Councillor Young.
Yes to both.
Thank you, Mike. I believe we've also got Councillor T. Richardson online as well this morning. Are there any other councillors online to record for the attendance? No? Right, thank you, members. Can I remind all participants in the meeting that are set out in the remote meeting etiquette guide, they should keep their microphones on mute so as to reduce the background noise in the meeting and also in the live stream. Can I also remind members that the voting process, as at all remote meetings, any agenda items that require a vote, it will be undertaken by a recorded vote. The vote will be taken by a roll call where each elected member, when called, should unmute their microphone and state their vote, either for, against or abstaining, and then mute afterwards. Thank you, members. Chairman.
Thank you, David. Moving on to item 1, apologies for absence. Do we have, do we have any apologies for absence?
I've received none in advance of the meeting, Chair.
Thank you. Any declarations of interest? Councillor Little.
Me in 6.2, home school transport, as I'm my husband's an operator for it.
Thank you. And Councillor Brown.
Sorry, Chair, I was a bit late off the mark there. Brenda Harrison is struggling to get on, so it's not an apology as such because she may be joining us very soon.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Little, can you lower your hand if you're finished? Thank you. Minutes of the meeting held on the 9th of March. Are there any questions or comments on those minutes? I've got Councillor Young.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, item 10, I didn't receive any feedback in relation to the paragraph on the turn of page about the numbers of homeless and about the breakdown of the procurement process for how the commercial organisation was chosen for the £61,440 contract.
Yeah, that's contained in the agenda a bit further on, Councillor Young, so we'll have a look at that for you. It's item number 7, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought.
Okay. So are there any comments or any other comments or questions on the minutes? And also for the subsequent minutes for the meeting Where's it gone? Of the Health and Wellbeing Board on the 2nd of December or the 10th of January for the Safer Hartlepool Partnership? No? Okay, thank you. Right, item 4.1, financial position update, Director of Finance and Policy.
Thank you, Chair. This report provides an update on 5 key areas covering the current year's budget, the financial impact of COVID, a look at the general fund budget for 21-22 future years, considerations in relation to the local council tax support scheme for 21-22, and also considerations of the housing revenue account. We set out, by way of background, some information around the history of the budget. The report is mainly focused on the general fund budget, but as I've said, it's going to cover other areas. I think members are well aware that up to 1920 we'd suffered 9 years of cuts in funding. The authority had made significant efficiencies and cuts in services over that period, and that included reducing the workforce by 20%, which was around 500 posts. That was all in response basically to a significant reduction in government funding. The current funding system was introduced in 13-14. The grant in that year that we received as a council from the government was just over £62 million. In the current year, in 1920, that had fallen to 36.6 million. So it was a reduction of 25.7 million. So a 41% cut in government funding, and effectively that provides the baseline for the general fund budget going forward. We'd set a balanced budget for the current year. It was based on using a minimum level of reserves of just over £500,000. And in February, we had a forecast deficit for 21-22 of £1.3 million. As I'll outline in the report later, the financial impact of the COVID pandemic's had an adverse impact on the financial position of the council on a range of factors, and I'll come on to that as we go through the report. Section 4 deals with the current year's budget and the forecast outturn. We've separated out the impact of COVID, and I think there are 2 reasons for that. One is so we're clear exactly what the cost of COVID is, and we can see that cost against the government grant, and also to let us look at our normal performance as if we hadn't had COVID in essence. In terms of the outturn overall, we've got some areas of the budget that are overspending. It is an early assessment. We've still got the winter months that drive some of the budgets, but fortunately we will underspend on some other areas, and that'll include low borrowing costs. We think overall that the general fund budget in isolation from COVID will come in on budget or thereabouts, and we can manage the increased costs, particularly in relation to looked after children in the current year. Section 5 deals with the financial impact of COVID. At the top of page 3, there are effectively 5 key factors we've faced in relation to COVID. There's increased expenditure, and that's things like support in the care sector. It's the cost of PPE equipment and support for vulnerable households, some of which has been funded from specific grants. There's reduced service income. In exactly the same case as we all see on the news, that businesses are losing income because they've been shut. Lots of our services have been shut. The leisure centre's been shut as an example, so we've lost that income. Our local council tax support scheme, we're seeing a significant increase already in the number of households that are eligible for support from that scheme. At the end of June, it had jumped up to 8%. Over the last couple of weeks, there's been a further increase in that figure of another 1%, and we expect there'll be further increases over the coming months as the furloughing scheme ends. Effectively, what that means is those households will become eligible to pay reduced council tax. That means the council will collect less council tax income from those people than we thought when the budget was set, and I'll come on to that later on in the report. There's also the impact on businesses. Regrettably, not all businesses will survive the economic impact, and if they go out of business, we're likely to see reductions in business rates. That's particularly difficult to monitor this year because the government have provided so many more reliefs to smaller businesses, and it could be some of that impact doesn't become obvious until next year because the small businesses in the town aren't having to pay the business rates. And we're also likely to see a reduction in new house building in the town. We did have a shutdown of effectively of the sector, and then house building is obviously restarting probably quite slowly. At a national level, the Local Government Association have estimated the costs in the order of 9.2 billion for all councils, and they still keep working on that. As a council, we've worked with the other North East councils to lobby the government for an appropriate level of funding. And Hartlepool's also been one of 15 Local Government Association case study authorities, which is effectively involves some fairly detailed interviews that LGA officials have had with myself and the Chief Executive. And I think that's been helpful in sort of trying to get the message across and all the context, also the context in terms of what it means in the real world. At paragraph 5.3, we've just highlighted a couple of comments from the Local Government Secretary and the Minister for Regional Growth about giving a commitment to support local government. So far, we've seen 3 tranches of funding at a national level, plus additional funding for income losses. The cash amounts to 3.7, so that's the certain amount. And then obviously there's a detailed formula for the income losses. I think the government announced the income loss arrangements at a national level about 3 weeks ago, and we're still waiting for the detail as to how that exactly works. So we'll update members when we get that information. What we've tried to do is summarise the financial impact for members at the table at paragraph 5.4. At the moment, it shows that an estimate that we'll be short by about 2.1 million in terms of the funding. That is based on an estimate of how much I think we may get from the income guarantee arrangements and support arrangements the government are putting in place, but that's not guaranteed. It will very much depend on the detailed arrangements the government put in place. What we've tried to do in that table is provide a breakdown between the COVID costs, which you can see in that table at 4.658 is our estimate. That can be obviously covered from the grant that we've received, because Hartlepool's received a total grant that's in excess of that amount of 6.976 million. We've then looked at the income, and we think we might get back about 3.1 million from the government's scheme. That would leave us 1.472 short, which if we can take from the tranche 1 and 2 funding would cover the income fees and losses off in the current year. And that leaves us with the collection fund, where we've made an assessment that the impact this year and next year will be 3 million. We've got 846,000 left of the grant, and that's how we end up with the deficit of the 2.1 million. We'll need a strategy to deal with that shortfall if the government don't come up with any further funding. And what we're suggesting is effectively we would capitalise that shortfall, and that would let us spread the cost over a number of years. We'd meet the result in loan repayment costs from the saving in the senior management structure that was approved by council, and also some additional savings in borrowing costs. There is a practical funding swap we need to do, because effectively the COVID costs are revenue. You can't capitalise revenue, but there's a technical way we can effectively achieve that. And that'll be something that we can implement through when the process of closing the accounts. Turning now to section 6, which deals with the general fund budget for next year, 21-22. We've started with a summary of the resources that I expect the council will have for the 21-22, and really that's just to highlight how dependent the council's budget is on council tax and the reduced ongoing effect of government grant, which is only making up just under £19 million of resources. We get specific grants of 17 million. So that's things like the public health grant and the various support for adult social care over the last few years. And then the balance of the funding is business rates and section 31 grants. As you've probably picked up from the press, the government have launched a spending review for the current year. I think the consultation date deadline is the 24th of September. That effectively suggests that by the time the government have taken account of the consultation responses, the local government finance settlement will be very late in December, which obviously makes planning quite challenging. I've highlighted in 6.4 a quote from the Chancellor about the spending review and him highlighting that there may be a need for tough choices, but obviously the Chancellor and the government haven't spelled out what they may be. That'll come out from the spending review. I think the other key context to the budget going forward is the government's recent council tax policy for the period 16-17 to 2021, which you'll know from previous presentations effectively has shifted the burden of funding local services away from government grant and onto council tax. And at 6.5 we've highlighted what the implications of that are on the council. I think the one that sticks out to me is that adult social care precept, which didn't exist in 13-14, in 2021 now raises £3.8 million for this council, and it's 11p in every pound that we spend on adult social care. 6.8, the national pay award for the current year is still not formally settled. It's with the unions at the moment, but employees have been offered 2.75%. In the current year, that's higher than our budget provision. Obviously, that builds in an increased recurring cost of about 400,000, which will have to reflect in the 21-22 budget. As I've alluded to, the council tax base, we had expected further growth in the council tax base for next year. I suspect that growth this year and next will be less in aggregate than it would have otherwise been because of COVID, when we factored that into our forecasts. That's an issue that we'll do further detailed work on later in the year when we know actually what's happened in the coming months, and we'll bring through the council tax base to committee to effectively approve later in the year. There are additional budget pressures, two issues, an increase in looked after children costs. Sally's on the line and be able to comment on that if members have any questions later on. But there's definitely been an impact from COVID on looked after children caseloads in the current year. Part of that cost we think we'll fund from the COVID grant and parts reflected in the outturn, but we think actually we'll need to make full provision for that pressure in our own budget for next year, for 21-22. Also think that the national living wage increase might be slightly higher than we'd made for provision for, and we probably need another 125,000 for that, based on current information. The other big factor that we think will affect next year's budget is continuing income shortfalls. As we reopen services, we'll not go back to business as usual straight away. It will take time. And in some areas it may never return to normal. People's behaviours may change. It's difficult to assess because we're just starting to open up services now. So we've taken a planning assumption that we get back to 75% of normal, but that would still leave us about 1.1 million short of existing income. And at this stage, I think it's prudent to build that into the budget forecasts. On a more positive note, hopefully, the government will recognise that their delays to the fair funding review and a permanent solution to social care funding, that they'll put more money into social care as they have for the last 2 years. Obviously that at the moment isn't a guaranteed position, but I think the track record of the last 2 years would suggest it's not an unreasonable planning assumption. And if they did that, Hartlepool might get another 2.2 million based on previous allocations. So what we've summarised at paragraph 6.9 is two scenarios. The first is the revised deficit that's just under 2.9 million, and that's based on the government providing the extra social care grant. And in case they don't, that gap would increase to just over 5.1 million. And I think it's just members need to see both sets of figures at this stage. Obviously, they're bigger deficits than we thought, and they're taking us back to the position we were in a few years ago, which is difficult and challenging for us. 6.10, we've set out a strategy for managing that. I think normally the advice would be we need a savings plan developed over the rest of the summer and into the autumn to deal with that. But I think we aren't in a normal position. There are a number of factors in that deficit, particularly around the income, for normal service income and housing reduction growth that might be temporary and just take time to resolve. So against that background, what we're suggesting in the report is it would be appropriate to use reserves to balance the budget for 21-22, on the understanding that members do recognise that that's not a permanent solution and it potentially delays the budget gap to the following year, 22-23. But I think the other rationale for recommending that as a strategy is there is so much uncertainty around the funding that hopefully the new funding does recognise need, and Hartlepool might, and I'll stress the word might, get a fairer funding settlement going forward. In terms of how we would do that, the table at 6.4 deals with the authority's reserves that are effectively uncommitted. We've basically got the budget support fund that was set aside to manage the budget over a number of years. We thought we'd use that to help phase in the changes to the new funding system, depending on the impact. As I've already said, they've now been delayed another 12 months to 22-23. And then we've got the strategic one-off cost reserve, which was predominantly for redundancy and early retirement costs if we'd made cuts. You can see in that table that potentially we've got sufficient reserves to fund either of the deficits. So if it's the deficit of just under 2.9 million, we'd have 2.7 of the reserve left. If it was the 5.1 million deficit, we'd be down to £500,000. Hopefully, we'll be looking at the position that leaves us with the 2.7 million reserve, because that would then help the authority manage the 22-23 budget and the risks that we continue to face. The other big part of the budget for next year is the level of council tax. All of the figures I've talked members through in the last few moments are based on what was agreed back in February of a 2% indicative increase, and that reflected the government spending plans, which anticipate that council tax revenue will increase across the country, and that reflects both a combination of housing growth and councils increasing council tax each year. We've highlighted if council tax frozen, that income's lost on a permanent basis. You can't catch it up in future years because the government's current referendum limits don't operate on a cumulative basis. They just operate on a year-by-year basis. I think some of the comments I've already made about council tax already in terms of the social care precept and the government referendum limits, for want of a better phrase, I think have effectively nationalised council tax increases. The whole system for funding councils is predicated on councils increasing the revenue from council tax through a combination of housing growth, a normal increase, and the social care precept. And I think that's been evidenced over the last few years by the vast majority. And I think it's been a handful, it's probably on one hand, who haven't implemented council tax increase as each year in line with the government's referendum limits to mitigate the impact on service of government grant cuts. Having said that it's nationalised as government policy, legally the local decision making still rests with the council, and members have the choice of either increasing council tax to protect council tax income and protect services, or accept if they implement lower increases or freeze council tax, there's less revenue to support services, and therefore budget cuts need to be made. I think members have expressed a desire to explore freezing council tax, and I think what I've alluded to in the report, effectively the only effective option for that would avoid service cuts would be to lobby the government to fully fund a council tax freeze for 21-22, and that's something that I'll come on to later in the report on lobbying points. I would stress at this stage we're not asking members to determine the council tax level for next year. That's one bit of the jigsaw that you can't yet determine. You'll need to wait later in the year when we've got the government's referendum limits, and we've also got the local government finance settlement. 6.25 sets out a series of suggested lobbying points for the spending review. I'll not go through all of them in detail. I think the key ones are what I've alluded to: lobbying for a council tax freeze grant that's provided separately and then continues in future years. It doesn't just disappear into the main grant. That the government provide a 2-year settlement for 21-22 and 22-23, I think we need to be arguing for a period of stability for our planning. And then we push the government that they can't keep putting off the sustainable changes they need to come in for 22-23, so that the authorities can have a sustainable resource base. And the final point around other potential lobbying arrangements, I think I've alluded to the LGR. I think have played a really key role in putting the case of local government for funding for COVID, and they continue to do that. But I think what it's identified, and this is something that the leaders picked up, that there isn't a special interest group for unitary councils. There's one for district councils. There's the one for the county councils within the LGA. The districts argued very well for the second tranche of funding. Some other councils have suggested establishing a special interest group for unitaries, and we're just asking if members have a view on whether Hartlepool should join that. Looking at future years, so 22-23 and 23-24, I think I've highlighted, we're waiting for a whole host of information from the government around national policy changes. They will be critical to Hartlepool because despite all of the cuts in funding over previous years, government grant funding and business rates income still fund 55% of everything the council spends effectively, and council tax the remaining 45 million. If the government don't start to increase their share of the funding cake, the council inevitably will just continue to face annual budget gaps, because you'll have inflation on the whole of your expenditure budget. You'll only have flexibility to raise income through council tax if government don't increase the council tax, and there'll be a gap. And that potentially is £2 million a year. So it's key that the government come up with a sustainable solution. The next part of the report, Chair, deals with the local council tax support scheme for 21-22. Members had previously asked us to bring this forward at the same time as the budget. We've just summarised that you did consult on the scheme last year, and after consulting on various options, you determined to stay with a 12% scheme. You did, in December, when you agreed the scheme, say that you would potentially wish to consult on a local council tax support option of 10%, which would be funded by effectively removing the welfare support budget. I think obviously you made that consideration before COVID. So what we set out in the report is what option do you actually want to consider for the 21-22 local council tax support scheme? And there are effectively two options for members to consider. One would be to stick with what we've got, a 12% scheme. And obviously that gives certainty to both the council's budget and households. Or you may wish to consult on alternative options. And that obviously, if you did, might want to include the option that you'd previously agreed back in December. And obviously when we get to the recommendations, it'll be helpful if members can provide a clear steer on that. I think the intention would be then your recommendation will go through to council early for a decision in terms of giving certainty of the local council tax support scheme. The position's similar in relation to housing revenue account. Again, you asked for the information earlier and to sit alongside the budget. And we've set out over the page, on page 16 of the report, basically two options. Option one would be to freeze rents. And we set out in the table, that potentially would give us borrowing of just over £3.1 million through a combination of borrowing and hopefully securing more Homes England grant. And that would deliver 28 properties. Or you could have a rent increase in line with the government's limit, which we think at the moment will be about 1.8% increase. The actual increase is determined by the September CPI. But with CPI being so low, I can't see it falling much further. If it was at 1.8, you could potentially have higher grants secured, higher borrowing, and potentially 5.9 of investment in the housing revenue account and 53 additional properties. Either of those options help make the HRA viable, and either of those options effectively could be implemented by members. And again, the recommendations would be helpful if members could provide guidance on one of those issues. Section 10 deals with the suggestion that members may wish to establish a community pot. We've got some one-off funding available that's summarised in section 10 of £225,000. It suggests in the report that members may wish to allocate 25,000 for a programme of activities fit for young people, and then the remaining allocated for other initiatives linked to food poverty and that type of thing. The recommendations in the report had suggested that a way of approving that. I think since the report was drafted, I think that time scale could delay getting the support out. And as the majority of the funding's coming from effectively government grant funding, it suggests that it actually, to avoid those delays, that actually the use of that funding is delegated to the Chief Executive in consultation with the Chair of F&P. Otherwise, it could take us many months to get the support out. And I think from what we're picking up, the needs there to try and move reasonably quickly on that in terms of getting out that support to the community. So you'll be glad, members, that I think just a few conclusions before we take any questions, then move to recommendations. I think really just the recap of the key issues from the report that the council had managed 9 years of austerity. I think as a council we've done it well. Our grants are a lot less, nearly 26 million less than it was in 13-14. That is a huge amount of money. We were in a good place, we thought, with the budget. Then we've obviously had the pandemic. That's had a huge impact on people's lives, but equally it's had a huge financial impact on the economy and councils. We think we're short still in terms of the funding that we'll receive from the government by just over £2.1 million. And there is a risk that shortfall increases if the income guarantee doesn't provide what we've estimated, and we'll have to deal with that from our own resources. And as I've said, I've set out a strategy for dealing with that. There's various factors impacted on the 21-22 budget that unfortunately increased the deficit, and we're looking at a deficit of just under 2.9 million to just under 5.11 million for next year. And we've got a whole period of further uncertainty of reforms that actually originally were going to be in for the current year have now been delayed even further into the future. So that doesn't help. So at that point, Chair, I think I've probably covered the key issues. I'll take any questions members may have. I think when we go to the recommendations, we might need to just go through them in blocks, because I think there are a number require members to make a choice rather than it's just yes or no to all of them, if that makes sense.
Can hear.
Thank you, Chris. And just before I go to other members, can I just take the opportunity to thank members, really, of this committee, especially for taking the difficult decisions you did last year, and especially in relation to the budget, because I know hindsight's a wonderful thing, but had we not taken the decisions we had, I think finding ourselves in this position, we would be in an awful mess right now. So I just wanted to take the opportunity while I could to thank you all for taking those difficult decisions last year, because I know they weren't easy. There's a few bits I'd like to bring up in relation to changes to the recommendations, sorry, but I'll let other people speak first. I've got Councillor Young wanting to speak first.
Thanks, Chair. I've got a number of points that I want to bring forward, so you're going to have to bear with me, I'm afraid. First of all, huge thanks for the ongoing navigation of all of this from officers and getting us through this challenging time. I think we're at a point where, as the Chair's just said, we would be in even more difficulty if we hadn't taken some of those hard decisions last year. 6.21 in my report, I don't know whether my report matches what Chris's does, but it's about council tax. He alluded to an exploration, and I think what we need of council tax freeze, and I think we need to get on record that is not a trip to the shops. It is a South Pole expedition type exploration, because I think we need to do everything we can to freeze council tax. Some of the ideas that I'm thinking of are a review of non-statutory services, and where outsourcing is a cheaper option and potentially a better option, we need to look at those options. That's what I'd say on that. I think item 7.1 talks about the LCTS. I think we should do everything we can to keep that at its current level, and I'd definitely be supporting it at its current level of 12%. Number 4, what I would like to find out is, sorry, I've had to write points on my piece of paper. Point 4 is, can we find out what the positive financial impact is of a long-term working from home policy? As we know, a lot of people have been working from home, and it would be good to assess and find out what kind of impact that is having financially. I assume positive towards the council. It may be it may have been a bit of a purchase issue in the beginning, and therefore a cost issue in the beginning. But longer term, I think that could pose as a good way forward. In terms of the community part, I think that's a fantastic idea, and I'd request that I be on that panel. So if the chair or whoever would endorse that, that'd be fantastic. I'd like to sit on that. Similarly, with other things that are coming up in the future to do with business, which are probably not in this report, but I'd like to be on that panel as well. Lisa's nodded, they're shaking her head, so I don't know why she's doing that. I'll be interested to see what her point is there. My final point is to do with the HRA. I don't see the point currently of us having a HRA budget, because some members, some who are even present in this meeting, don't appear to want to spend it. So it'd be good to maybe grease the wheels a little bit and find a way forward to have budget spent. And I'm trying to hold my anger, so at this point I'll pause for a breath.
Thank you, Councillor Young. Councillor Akers-Belcher.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got a few questions as we go through. Chris, first of all, you mentioned the leisure centre and the loss of income. And I know from previous dealings with sport and recreation, it costs us around about £500,000 a year to run sport and rec, because we subsidise it across the town. So would it be possible for it to be circulated what the projection cost to the council is in this current year, because we need to know that going forward if we're going to be setting a budget, especially if we only looking at capacity going forward of 75%. The second point I want to make is with regards to what Mike has already mentioned about outsourcing, and there's a big shift talking about housing growth. And I know from my dealings with regeneration that sometimes our own planning service is a barrier to housing growth. So I think we need some sort of, as we're running along with the budget, some independent review of what applications we've received in where builders have basically walked away, and we may have to review our policy around 106 contributions, because if that's a barrier, like no build is actually bringing no income in. It isn't just about 106 monies, it's about council tax. And in actual fact, there's an argument to be had that if you receive less 106, that accelerates growth. At least you would have council tax coming in, and I would like that to be weaved into like our budget process for this year. With regards to the HRA and the rents, like, you know, I've made it very clear in the past I don't support, and especially in the current climate, a rent increase. And I think if we could get an additional 28 properties, I'd be more than happy with that. Another decision that we made last year as part of the budget was that members would be involved in a review of all fees and charges going forward. And I don't see that as part of the report and where that is going to fit in. And the last point was with regards to what Mike raised about local council tax support, and it's jointly with the community pot, is the conversation we had around local council tax support was to review it in conjunction with reviewing local welfare support, to see what our options were. It wasn't an either or, it was what we were going to do about local welfare support and whether or not we could lower local council tax support and what that would look like going forward. So I think it's very black and white to say it's either 12% or 10%, because in actual fact, some of the COVID money can be earmarked for local welfare schemes, which brings me on to item 10, the community pot, because there's no mention in that makeup of the 225, the money that is coming from COVID, which is for local welfare. And I think we need to marry the two up together. And also there is an underspend in this year's budget on members' allowances. So why couldn't we put the underspend in members' allowances while we're carrying 3 vacancies into that community pot also? That's all my questions. I'll wait and see how many answers I get.
Chris, are you able to come back with any of them?
Can I have mine answered as well, please? Because he's had 2 sets of points there, so it'd be good to get mine answered too, please.
I'll try. I think I managed to jot most of them down. I think in relation to the first question about the leisure centre income, we can certainly provide that breakdown. Effectively, it's all reflected in the figures within the report. Behind the figures in the report, as I've said at the start, we've split the impact of COVID out of the budget this year, because I think it was important to demonstrate what COVID's cost the council, both costs and income losses. So obviously there's a build up behind that. So we can give that analysis. I think as well the strategy that we've set out in the report wasn't to pick out individual services within that estimate of the 1.1 million loss of income. It was to look at it in the whole, because I think, as I said through the report, it's a bit too early for us to assess individual services, because we're just starting to bring them back on stream at the moment. So that's something we can look at. I think the question.
Sorry to interrupt. Does that mean that I am going to get it on Sport and Rec, the breakdown, or not?
I've got no problem providing it on Sport and Rec. I think it's easy enough. It's just I was just giving the context to the approach we've adopted in the report. The second question about health and growth, I think is probably one for Denise to take. I think the HRA one was a comment about supporting the freeze. I think the comment about fees and charges, I suppose we'd see. We need to see the formal views of the committee on that. I think the thing I'd probably say at the moment is, as we move, we're going to be in a recovery phase, and I think for a lot of the council services, that recovery phase is going to be this year and next year. So it's going to be a difficult assessment to undertake. And I suppose that would be my response to that question. In relation to local council tax support, I'll be open and honest. I think I have in the report made it quite a simple choice between the options of either stick with what we've got and consult on various options. It's quite resource intensive consulting. You had the results of the consultation from last year that didn't support a change. Obviously, if members want to consult on further options, if that's what you task us to do today, we will do that work for you. But I must admit, I think there's part of me thinks the authority's got an awful lot to deal with, and ultimately, keeping the scheme stable for a further year and keeping the local welfare support scheme stable might be helpful in the current climate. But obviously, members may have a view that they want us to support issues. Christopher, can I just ask for clarification in relation to the COVID local welfare? Local support, is that the funding that we got, the reduced council tax bills that you're referring to for local council tax recipients?
Part of it in the previous report is that there was a surplus left over that could be used for like other welfare schemes, and I'm not aware whether or not that has already been allocated elsewhere. I may have missed it, I'm not sure, but what I was trying to get the point over is, if it is still there, why don't we just include it in a bigger pot where it's all around welfare, because the outcomes are the same?
Right. I think it's the answer I gave earlier in the year. We've allocated probably the bulk of that pot already, because it was obviously to be paid to existing local council tax eligible households. It also has to be paid pro rata to those who've become eligible in the year. So as the caseload's increased, that's used up more of that funding. I think what I previously indicated to members is we'd review that later in the year, because I think the furlough scheme is going to have a second blip in that caseload increase, and that lead up a whole lot more of that money. So I think that probably hopefully answers your question. That we're going to come back on that. That it's a piece of work that needs doing, but we need to see what the caseloads are, and then obviously we can bring back options in relation to that. I think one of the comments we need to be careful with is it's going to be difficult to manage that money. It's not clear if that money has to be repaid at the end of the current year if it isn't spent. But then we've got the dilemma is we can't make any decisions yet because we don't know how many more people are going to come through and be eligible for it. So it's a real difficult balancing act, that one. But I'm fairly confident that we'll be able to make sure that money doesn't leave Hartlepool. It's been allocated by the government and we will get it out into our community one way or another. And it might mean we need to make some quick decisions, but we'll come back and involve members in that. So I think I've covered them all, Councillor Akers-Belcher.
There was just a comment with regards to housing growth and 106, because it may mean that if we're going to review the policies around 106, it'll need to be referred for consultation with both planning and regeneration.
I think Denise is going to come in to answer that one, Christopher.
Morning, everyone. I think the very good points raised and quite pertinent, Councillor Akers-Belcher, especially as the planning consultation has just been announced, which we are currently going through as officers. And that response has to be, well, the deadline for that is the 29th of October. So what I propose is we work on the response to that, share it with yourself as Chair of Regeneration, the Chair of Planning, and also the Leader of the Council to make sure you're comfortable with our response to the consultation. Because my concern is we could do a lot of work reviewing that, and the government are going to change that anyway, because they're looking at replacing Section 106 with a national centralised model. So we could be doing a lot of work that's going to change. So I would prefer, if members were happy with that we work together on the response on the government consultation. We'll then get a view from what members want, and depending on the timescale for that being implemented, we can then come up with a timeline for looking at those changes.
Thanks, Denise. Mike, will you want to come back?
Yeah, just on the first of all, just on the point that Denise has just made, I think there are certain local issues to do with planning that need review urgently, though, and I think they're being looked at the moment as well. So I think yes, I agree with we've got to do something in line with what's happening nationally, but we definitely do need something to happen locally as well. The only other things I was going to say, Lisa was shaking her head at some point during what I was saying. I'd be interested to know what her opposition was there. If she wants to come in and answer that, that'd be good. And the other point was none of my points that I raised, and I think there were 6 of them, have been addressed by Chris at all. So it'd be good to get some feedback from Chris if he's able on some of the points that I raised, if he's jotted them down as well. Thank you.
Chris?
Yeah. Right, I've jotted 3 things down, so if I've missed anything, I'll just remind me at the end and I'll come back to them. Because I jotted some down I thought were more your observations around freezing council tax, but obviously linked to that, I think you'd made the point about a review of non-statutory services and potential alternative service delivery models if they were more cost effective. Again, I think if that's what the committee want officers to be tasked with, I suppose if that's what the committee tasks us to do, we can do that work. Obviously, that will involve members' choices, and the only issue is I think we just need to be careful around the capacity. That if we're still dealing with COVID, and your officers are, and dealing with recovery and day-to-day about the capacity to deal with lots of different requests. So I think just a plea to members. I think you had I'd noted as an observation on LCTS about maintaining the current scheme. I think you definitely had a question about the financial impact of working from home. And I think that's something we could look at bringing information back on. I think that's going to be quite a complicated piece of work and take quite a while. We've already started as a corporate management team looking at those issues in terms of how much of the current working from home will we continue to do, and the pros and cons of working from home, because it's got some benefits, but it's also got lots of disbenefits. And I think people are starting to pick up, some of the mental health problems that potentially causes for some people. Some people have really struggled working from home, and I think just can't wait to come back and work with the colleagues. There are some pieces of work that it just don't work effectively, and working in teams is helpful. I think, if I'm being honest with members, I would suggest that that's more an issue for the following year's budget, for not the 21-22. I think there's a lead-in time around the whole assessment of. I think CMT's recognised the pandemic it sort of to some extent speeded up thoughts that we were having already, but put us in a place to say, actually, do we need to look at what buildings we've got, where we don't need them? We don't need as many buildings because more people can work from home, but all of those issues. And to be honest, I think personally, and I don't know what Denise, as your incoming MD, might have a view on it. I'd probably say that's more an issue for the year after's budget, for 22-23. But obviously, taking members on that journey with us, that we can bring update reports as we progress that. And after that, Mike, I'm afraid I didn't write them down. So if you want to fire what I've missed back at me, I'll answer them. Sorry.
No, I think that sums it up perfectly, to be honest. Because I think the other points that I made were kind of requests rather than questions as such. So it was to sit on the community panel deciding those grants was one of the things that I've mentioned. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Denise, were you just wanting to come back to respond to that before I bring other members in?
Yes, thank you, Chair. It was just on the working from home policy, and you'll notice in the next report, which is the recovery and renewal plan, we've actually got a work stream called Organisational Change and Resilience, and that piece of work is identified to be undertaken as part of the recovery stream. So members obviously will be involved in that process. So it was just to clarify that point. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Right, I've got Councillor Lindridge wanting to speak.
Thank you, Chair. There's quite a few of the points that have been answered, what I've made notes about. Took us a couple of hours to read through this, but you've had about 2 or 3 months, Chris, so it'll be difficult for me to scrutinise in real detail. Anyway, could you tell me in terms of 6.8 about the increase in looked after children? I mean, maybe Sally can answer this. You've made a budget there of 0.7 million as part of the costs that can be funded from the COVID grant, and a further 0.4, which could be managed within the overall general budget. That implies to me that that figure's being based on what? We've got an increase in care for these looked after children. I think this is going to increase because of the COVID lockdown. There's lots of issues that's unknown in the last 3 months, where there might have been domestic violence or mental health issues with children. And that impacts on the carers that we have or haven't got. So does that mean that if there's a surge in these cases, you must have got an estimated amount? What if it goes across that, above that? And what's the cost implications? Are we going to cover ourselves for that? But more importantly, obviously, it's health and well-being of the young people and the carers as well. That's my first one.
Okay, I think Chris said he can answer a part of it, and then Sally will come in with the rest.
I'll just clarify the values that we've built into the report. I think, as you pointed out, that in the current year, it is about 1.1 million, the cost increase. So we funded 0.7 million from the COVID grant and 400,000 from the council's outturn. If you read further on, what we're saying is for next year to increase that provision to 1.35 million, and that will give us a little bit of headroom. I think Sally will come on and explain actually what's happened. I think what hopefully she'll say is that headroom will give us the capacity to deal with what we know and a little bit for what we don't know. But I think this is an area that continues to be a risk for councils financially, and obviously the bigger concern, it's a risk for the children actually involved in the circumstances. But I'll hand over to Sally, but hopefully that clarifies the financial values.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So In terms of explaining the increase in the numbers of children looked after, we, for the previous 12 months or so before COVID started, we had between around 295, 305 children in our care. When we went into lockdown arrangements, we were advised that we should not be, children should not be leaving care. So those young people who are sort of moving on to independence and things like that, that they should continue to be supported and looked after in their placements. So that's why we've seen sort of a net increase in the numbers of children looked after, and we're around about 335 at the moment. So sort of from our previous maximum, that's an increase of around 20 children and young people. Parallel to that, the lockdown has had a significant impact on the courts and the capacity of the courts to manage their work. And again, that's another process through which children have their permanence established through placements such as adoption, return to parents, special guardianship. So that's another reason for the net increase in the children in care. In terms of the placement capacity, it's an important point to raise. Currently, we have been able to continue as far as possible to place children within our own resources. There were some flexibilities implemented by the Department for Education to allow us to do emergency registrations of foster carers, for example. We haven't had to rely on those flexibilities, but that's at least giving us a little bit of capacity flexibility. Those flexibilities have now ended and they are no longer open to us. So that's I think partly that's where the cost arises, because once our own in-house provision, which is very good, is full, the cost of external provision is significantly higher than in-house provision, because you are paying fostering agencies, etc., independent children's homes. So the cost of external provision is higher. We've managed to keep that low for the time being, but it does have a cost impact. And we're working currently to look at options to have capacity, increase our in-house capacity ready for the autumn, when we know that we'll need, again, more placements potentially. When the schools go back nationally, the Association of Directors of Children's Services are saying there will be a spike, there will be an impact. You know, we will suddenly be seeing children who perhaps have not been seen for several months and may have had, we don't know what their lived experience during lockdown has been. So we are making preparations for how we are going to support families as children are returning to schools, and support schools to meet the needs of those children. But we do sadly, I suppose, anticipate that there will be a further rise in demand for children's services, and that's why Chris is recognising that there is a longer term challenge here, rather than just arising from placement capacity and everything will return to normal. I genuinely don't think it will.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I've got does that answer everything, Jim?
Yes, that's fine. In relation to the forecast based on a 2% council tax increase, I do agree with Mike when we need to be lobbying as hard as we can that if there is a freeze on, and it takes the pressure off local government. And I do feel as if we've taken the brunt of this now, and the responsibility is falling on individual councillors rather than the government. And if they change their business rate granting funding that we've discussed in the past, that'll probably put a massive pressure on that by the council. The actual rates that we've collected in earlier on, I think we've done really well. You know, I think figures were 28% or something on the earlier figures that I looked at. They weren't as bad as I thought, considering the lockdown and the businesses that we've had. I think we've done quite well to sort of get that income in, so to speak. Yeah. In terms of the just give us a minute, the local council tax support, I do believe we should retain that at 12%. We can't change that to the detriment of the people in need. I know someone else has got to pay for that, but we've got to look after the residents, the needy residents and the vulnerable ones that's actually using that facility. On the community pot on 10.1, I do agree that any funds that we can sort of siphon off, if that's the phrase to use, to go into a community pot so we can decide on a needs basis where those funds are allocated, I would agree with that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Lindridge. We've got Councillor Smith wanting to speak.
It's just to reply to Mike in regards to the reason why I was shaking my head. I don't know, but I believe that Mike has clients and he helps clients get contracts, etc. And that if he sits on that those panels, then he would sort of help his clients get funding. And I don't think that that's what people sitting on funding panels should really be able to do. I think it should be a completely
So what you're accusing me? What are you accusing me of? Are you saying that I couldn't declare an interest on a particular item?
No, I'm saying that I don't believe people who have any other interest that help any businesses in the town should sit on a panel to be able to divert funding. I'm not saying that you would.
So
I'm saying people on there shouldn't be able to. Should be completely independent.
Right, hang on.
I think I'll
hang
say
on. Right, hang on. Right, we'll stop that there. Right. I've got Chris. So you want to come back on something?
I think just on a couple of points of council.
Sorry, Chair. Can I say I want it on record that I'm going to be seeking legal advice on those comments made.
Okay. Chris.
So just to provide a bit of clarity and information, some of the comments, questions Councillor Lindridge raised. I think the council tax, getting clear and strong for members about lobbying for a council tax freeze with the government. One of the rumours we're hearing is that the government may potentially be considering relaxing the referendum limits, which would mean they didn't set them or they set them at a higher level. And it could be that the government view increasing council tax as part of the solution to repairing the public finances. But you're right, as members, to push the government for that. It was just to give you some of the context. And really just to give members a little bit of an update that on the collection levels, because the figures in the report were at the end of June that stayed for council tax have stayed steady at the end of July. And business rates, our collection levels have improved. So we were about 6% short on the previous year at the end of June. We've got that shortfall down to 4.7% at the end of July. So that's something positive and pleasing in terms of the local position.
Thank you, Chris. Councillor Smith, we want to come back on something in relation to the report? No. Have you got your hand up for another reason? No? All right. It's the same with you, Councillor Young. Are you finished?
I think I'd like some examples of where that's happened in the past, to be honest. I'd like to know where Lisa's getting that intelligence from and look to get evidence kind of put forward as where that's happened in the past, where I've personally been involved in funneling money to businesses that I may work for.
To be fair, I don't
Did
think
I actually say that you fund money?
Hang on.
You said that.
Right, stop.
I'm not saying that you did.
Stop.
I just said that they shouldn't.
There's a mute button. Right, stop, please. Thank you. Councillor Akers-Belcher, we'll come back in and then we'll need to move to the recommendations because we do have quite a bit of extra stuff to go through.
Chair, it was just a comment about, you know, what Councillor Lindridge mentioned as well about, like, you know, money into the pot. And I did mention about the underspend on councillors' allowances. But based on what Mike Young's just said as well, I actually think some of the comments have been inappropriate because there's a suggestion that a member on this council would break the law. And I think, like, you know, I think, Mike, it's right and proper that he just takes legal opinion.
Denise?
Thank you, Chair. It was just to draw members' attention to 10.3 in the report, where the proposal for allocating the community pot would be made by Finance and Policy Committee. So just members are clear that's already been set out in the report.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we need to make a move on the recommendations. So if members can turn to them, they start on page 19. 13.1, the first recommendation is that we note that it is anticipated an increase in looked after children costs be funded. Are members happy to note that? Any dissent? No, thank you. Oh, sorry, Chris is just wanting to come in on that one. Yeah, I've got.
You're on mute, Chris.
You're on mute.
Sorry. It's in relation to the comment Christopher made about members' allowances. At the moment, that's reflected in the overall outturn position. So we've assumed that that's savings in there. But if members want us at the year end to have a look at if that's not needed for the overall strategy, to look at it in the way you've asked for, we can do that at the year end or later in the year when the position's clearer, if that helps clarify that one.
Okay. Yeah, I'm all right with that. Thank you. So then the next recommendation is to note the anticipated government grant funding to cover the forecast COVID costs and to note the forecast collection fund deficit. Is everybody happy with that? And is there any dissent?
Agreed.
Thank you. General fund budget. So we are to note the pandemic has had an adverse effect on the council's financial position. Everyone all right with that one? Yeah.
Agreed.
Okay, now we're being asked to endorse then the proposed strategy to fund this shortfall from reserves, while noting that this is not a permanent strategy and defers the deficit until 22-23, effectively giving us a longer lead in time. Is there any dissent from that? Thank you. So we're being asked to approve the suggested submission to the spending review submission and letter to Simon Clarke. Everybody happy with that one?
Agreed.
Yeah. And determine if the council should support the establishment. Sorry, Christopher, I didn't see that.
On that, the submission, it actually says, including lobbying for a fully funded council tax freeze grant and noting that they have not provided, council tax will need to increase in line with government set referendum limit to protect services. And I don't agree with that.
All right.
Because until we get the decision back, because they could actually increase the referendum limits to 10%.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sticking my hand up for a 10% increase in council tax when I won't be sticking my hand up for any increase.
Great point. So let me just fully funded council tax freeze. So if we can remove everything after council tax grant and noting. Yeah. And then we can look at that separately.
Agreed.
Okay, so then the next one, determine the council should support the establishment of a special interest group for unitary councils within the LGA to provide a forum. Just in relation to this one, I didn't mean to speak earlier, I do apologise. The reason I feel this is important is because during the second tranche of funding allocations to local government, it was very apparent that district councils who had a seat around the table were able to lobby government very hard, and you can see that from the funding allocation. The district councils got a disproportionate amount, and I think it's very important unitaries like ourselves are able to get a seat around that table to get the maximum out of that. So if everybody is happy with us joining a new special interest group within the LGA, we'll move forward with that. Any dissent?
Agreed.
Thank you. Right, moving on to local council tax support scheme. We're being asked to determine which of the options we will go for, and I think so far all members have spoken all members who have spoken in favour of us maintaining the LCTS scheme at 12%. Is that a fair assessment? Does anybody want to dissent from that?
Agreed.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Just as a further recommendation to this actual part, I would like to put in, and if someone would, if members are happy, someone can second it, that we write to the government and ask them to recognise that COVID is the first time the local council tax support scheme has been tested by a major economic shock since it became the council's responsibility in 13-14. And so the government needs to recognise that the impact will be uneven and has a greater impact in councils that serves more deprived communities. Therefore, rather allow communities to repay the resulting collection fund deficit over 3 years, which will affect the council, police and fire, the government should fully fund these temporary deficits in 2021 and 22, which will remove the financial uncertainty and protect local services. I've got a copy of that I can send out to people if yeah.
I'll second that, Councillor Moore.
Thank you, Councillor Lindridge. Is everybody happy with us sending that letter off and raising that point as well?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Looking at the HRA, we did need to determine whether we're going to freeze rents for 21-22. And again, I think the consensus so far has been that we would look to freeze it this year. Is there any dissent at this point on that one? No. And the community pot, recommend to the council establishment of a community pot. 1 second. Yeah, so sorry, what was did you say the change for this recommendation was, Chris? I haven't got it written down. Do apologise.
I think the second part was rather than decisions being made by an F&P, because it could delay the process, to delegate to the chief exec in consultation with the chair of F&P.
So was it to remove the second bullet point effectively?
To replace the second bullet point.
Yeah.
So it's effectively the whole of the, I suppose, sorry, no, it doesn't.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah. I'll start again. 2 points. Clarify, it doesn't need to go to full council because it's mainly grant funded. And then the second point was effectively for both pots to be delegated to the chief exec in consultation with the chair of F&P to approve the use. Okay. And the latter part, both of it's to speed up the process and get the support out in the community as soon as practical and possible.
Okay. Chris, Councillor Akers-Belcher.
Thank you, Chair. I think given the comments that have been made today, I would rather leave the second bullet point in as it is and for it to come to finance and policy, even if we have to convene a special one, which we can do over Teams within 7 days.
Is there anybody who would second that, or is there any issue with it?
I'll second it.
Did someone speak? Yeah. Right, okay. Okay, so well, is there any dissent from that change then, I guess is the question. No? Okay, we'll leave that one in. And we probably will have to then call an additional Finance and Policy Committee so we can get these out as quickly as possible. Right, that's everything on this one. Yeah.
Can I just mention one thing? Sorry, I've got my hand up. It was just that we never really nailed what was happening with fees and charges. And I do have a concern with regards to having a look at the planning consultation, because at some point that will have to come back, because the response to the planning consultation, whilst I agree with it wholeheartedly, it's important that the lead-in time is to change primary legislation, which could take 3 years. Well, we have a problem with housing growth here and now. So I think we should work on the consultation. That has to be the priority. But at the point when we submit that consultation, we can bring it back to Finance and Policy, the response, and say, is there anything we can do locally now to accelerate housing growth? And that could be something we could consider.
Yeah, is someone seconding that?
Why not?
Yeah. Okay. Right, thanks very much. So we'll move to item 5.1. COVID-19 Recovery and Renewal Plan. So this is a joint report with the Chief Executive and Director of Regeneration and Neighbourhoods.
Thank you, Chair. And just to place on record my thanks for the work the corporate management team have done on the budget, because that's a critical part of the recovery process. Members will be aware, obviously, that COVID has had a profound impact socially and economically on the country, where we are facing now a recession. And what we do know is that some geographical areas will be harder hit by the impact of COVID. particularly those areas which were already experiencing significant challenges as a result of inequalities in relation to health, the economy, and in terms of educational outcomes. And Hartlepool is one of those areas, as is the North East as a whole, that will be more severely hit by the impact of COVID than other areas of the country. We therefore agreed as a council to undertake a wide-ranging consultation exercise to help us understand what was already happening, which has involved conversations with a wide range of partners, our own staff, the voluntary and community and faith sectors, and with members, to help us understand how people were recognising the challenges that we face in the town at the moment, and also looking at ideas for what we need to do to collaborate to move forward across sectors and across the whole system, to begin to look at ways in which we can mitigate the the impact of the crisis on the town. And that's been a really stimulating conversation, and Denise and I are really grateful for the contributions that everybody has made. We've also worked with the Combined Authority, who has also been undertaking an assessment of the economic impact of COVID on the region, and formulated a recovery and renewal plan. We have a statutory responsibility whenever an emergency is declared to produce a recovery plan. But what the recovery plan, which is attached to this report at Appendix A, identifies, is that this is an emergency like no other. It's an emergency which will be far-reaching, which will create high levels of uncertainty, which will probably mean that we will come out of this crisis with new models of service delivery. And it is a recovery which we were in for the long haul. We do know, and we went into this crisis as a council from a number of strengths. We had high-performing services, we had strong services. We also had a capital plan, which we had already formulated to help accelerate change and accelerate the economic growth of the town. And we recognise that what we need to do is significantly to increase the pace of delivery of that plan. And what this plan identifies, members will be aware, is that we need to deliver some key priorities under a number of themes where we've identified in the report where the impact we think of COVID will be hardest. And we've identified a number of themes for engaging people widely in taking forward action plans to deliver those themes. So that the plan identifies, and now it's a long document and members have had an opportunity to read it, so I won't take you through it line by line, but it's informed by an impact assessment which identifies that we need to take action under a number of different pillar themes. The first is in relation to what it means for us as a council in terms of organisational change and resilience. And I think the chart under, which is chart 1 of Appendix A, which in a sense summarises the plan, has been put up as a presentation for members. And I apologise that even I am struggling to read it, but it identifies the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, a number of pillars, which first start with organisational change and resilience, where we know as a council we now need to go through the process of restarting council services, and that will take time. We are going through a period where we have to live through this virus, and the way in which we restart services will have to be in a COVID secure way, and that will have an impact on a number of different things: the service model for delivery, the resource capacity to do that, the need to adapt our buildings, the need to develop new operating procedures, and we are going through the process of doing that at the moment. We also need to improve the infrastructure for supporting people who are working from home. We know that working from home is something that has worked for us. We've managed to implement very quickly the ICT infrastructure to support it. And we have managed to get to the point where 40% of our staff have been working from home. We are going through an exercise of trying to look at how we can sustain that going forward, looking at ways in which we can improve the infrastructure for that, improving the support for staff working from home, and also looking to adapt our buildings to come up with a hybrid model so that staff can come in to work from home, to work in the office when they need to, but also be able to work from home when we're able. We recognise that our workforce development programme will need to change as a key area, but the point that Councillor Young has made about going forward, we do recognise that what this might mean for our state estate permanently, for our office accommodation permanently, is that we may be in a position where we can reduce our requirement for office accommodation, develop a new model for delivering services in community settings more directly and accessibly to our residents, but also look at ways in which we can reduce our office accommodation requirement. That will take time to deliver. We were already looking at that as a way forward initially, but we need to accelerate that now, and new service models will come out. The point that was made about outsourcing, if I could just comment on that, because that is a process that we will need to consider in terms of what new service models are going forward. We know from experience, and certainly for ourselves, but also nationally, that outsourcing isn't necessarily a way of saving money. In fact, there's a number of examples nationally where that's happened, and that councils have then insourced because the costs have been driven up. What will be really important will be for us to look at ways in which we need to change our service models going forward, and then think about what the best alternative service deliveries might be according to the need. And that is all work that will need to be done under that work stream. Health and social care, we know there's been a major impact on the health and social care system within the town. We need to come forward now with an action plan with our partners for improving access, for improving digital and remote access to treatment services for our residents, and also looking at ways in which we can develop and accelerate our programmes to protect our residents by enabling them to live healthier lives, because we do know that the impact of COVID has been the hardest on people who have underlying health conditions. A really critical work stream for us members is in relation to the business economy, jobs, skills and growth. We know that the number of job losses in the town and in the country will be exponential, and we will need to look at ways in which we can stimulate our local independent sectors by using our own purchasing powers and providing support to those sectors, but also look at ways in which we can attract new investment into the town. A critical industry for us, however, is the culture, heritage and tourism industry. It formulates quite a significant part of our town's economy, our borough's economy, and a major programme will need to come forward for how we reanimate and help support that sector going forward. In terms of the wider impacts on the community, we know they have been substantial in relation to the economic well-being of our community, the financial and digital poverty that we have seen, the impact on the supply of food, potential impact on fuel economy, and it is critical for us to work hand in hand with our voluntary and community sector to look at ways in which we can establish strong partnerships to build community capacity, to help build routeways out of the poverty that will be created and also mitigate its impact. And that is where obviously the community part will come in as a critical element for that. We also know that the education of children and the impact of this on vulnerable children has been substantial, and working with our schools to help the reopening of schools and to develop a new curriculum model which will help not just help children catch up, but also help tackle some of the mental and emotional well-being issues that children have experienced through this, and young people will be really important in relation to working with our partners. And there's a range of proposals there for how we can work with schools and with other partners to help the schools accelerate programs to help children catch up and to tackle some of the educational inequalities that we face in the town. And finally, the other pillar theme and working group is around the environment and infrastructure. We need to look at ways in which we can improve the physical environment, improve connectivity in the town, and strengthen our approach to tackling antisocial behaviour, dog fouling, and fly tipping in the town as critical issues that we've had to sustain throughout the crisis. Underpinning those pillar themes will be two work streams which focus on finance, making sure that our budget is driving recovery and that our budget itself can recover, and also communication. We've seen through this crisis how important it is for us to be able to communicate in all sorts of different ways and reach our residents so that they understand what they need to do to protect themselves, what they need to do to access help when they need it, and what they need to do to stop the spread of the virus. And that will be a critical programme going forward. The majority of these programmes will not just be working groups for the council. They will be the whole framework set out there in Chart 1 sets out a framework for engaging partners across the whole of the system in the town, so that the working groups will have a membership which will be drawn from the different sectors and partners, and will need to work hand in hand with the council committees and council and the Health and Wellbeing Board to make sure we provide the framework for enabling the governance of our recovery to be a system-wide approach rather than something which is seen as simply the council's responsibility, but the council does have a core responsibility for leading that. Finally, the plan we think we are recommending will need to be developed with underpinning action plans for each of the themes, which will cover the short, medium and longer term objectives of the recovery and the renewal of the town. In the first 6 months, we recognise that we will need, as a council, to start looking at ways in which we can invest in some early quick wins. But we also recognise that the funding that it will take, the fiscal stimulus that it will take to help accelerate recovery and renewal of the town will be way beyond the resources available to the council and partners, and will require significant economic investment. We know that we are already in a position where we are one of the 100 towns that would benefit from the town deal, and we need to make sure that is integrated into this. We need to make sure that we put ourselves in pole position for high street funding, but we also need to work with the combined authority to make sure that any devolved funding to drive economy for the Tees Valley finds its way into Hartlepool and connects with our recovery plan, and that will be an important piece of work for us going forward, for the council going forward in relation to the Tees Valley Combined Authority. But the two pots that we are recommending establishing are covered in section 4 of the report. The first relates to a business support fund, which the council has already earmarked £500,000 from the Indigenous Growth Fund that we received from the Combined Authority to invest in local business investment schemes. That was originally identified as a fund which would operate on a revolving loan basis. But what we do now know is that businesses, our local businesses, are very averse to taking out further loans because of the financial liabilities they're already carrying. And we're recommending that we now repurpose that as a business support fund to help support our local businesses, and also look at ways in which we can allocate funds to help with the reanimation of our visitor and tourism economy. The proposal is that specific criteria to drive this and the application process will be developed in consultation with the business community and with the Chair of Regeneration and the Chair of Finance and Policy. The community fund has already been covered in the business report, but that does respond to the dialogue that we've had with the voluntary community and faith sectors. And they've played a critical role in coordinating local capacity to meet needs during the crisis. And going forward, it's going to be really important to develop strong and coordinated relationships with that sector, which enables us to fleet of foot invest in community-led initiatives to tackle the root causes and impact of poverty and social isolation within our communities. A number of different areas have been identified in terms of food, fuel and digital poverty. And in this report, we were recommending that 200,000 of that is allocated to supporting community-led initiatives in tackling poverty, and and 25,000 of that would be allocated towards providing new out-of-school opportunities. I'd note the point that this, in a sense, is the beginning of something, and it will be really important as we move towards outturn and as we move towards formulating the budget for 21-22, that we look at ways of replenishing that pot on an ongoing basis with any opportunities that the council can find to do that. It'll be important to develop criteria for that pot prior to it being considered by Finance and Policy, and it's proposed that the specific criteria will be developed in consultation with the sectors, in consultation with the chairs of adult and children's services and the chair of Finance and Policy. The hope, I think, initially was that we could then, through that means, agree the allocations, but that would obviously give us an opportunity, if we get approval to develop the criteria and process, that will give us an opportunity to try and get the recommendations through to Finance and Policy Committee as quickly as possible. So the recommendations in relation to the report are outlined in section 13. Which is that you note the feedback from the wide-ranging consultation that we've received back from members, which is attached as an annex to this report, that you consider and endorse the recovery and renewal plan and the governance framework for that, and that you approach that you approve the creation and the approach to take forward the single community fund, and that you approve the reframing and repurposing of the £500,000 business loan fund to provide the grant scheme. Just to say, I think we are the only council that I'm aware of that has developed a recovery and renewal plan based on such wide-ranging consultation, and I do believe that the recovery will be dependent upon how well we can engage with our partners. So this becomes more than a council plan and becomes a system-wide plan. And there's a real appetite in our communities and with our business leaders and with our partners to do that. So I think this provides a framework for taking that forward. Denise and I are happy to take any questions, and I'll hand back over to you now, Chair. Thank you.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Jill. I've got a couple of members wanting to speak. So I had Councillor Young with his hand up first.
Thank you, Chair. Just on the point that Jill made about outsourcing, we maybe need to look at the contracts that we already outsourced and to see if they're actually valuing for money, the IT contract and things like that. I think we need to build that in, because the comments that have been made are that in some cases they are good value, in some cases there aren't good value, but I think we need to take a kind of golden thread approach to this, something that I've been accused of not being able to do in this meeting. Thank you.
Councillor Lindridge.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, comprehensive report. I think it's a great recovery plan. You know, it took me quite a while to read through this, and I think it shows the importance that we look at the town deal and high street funds. Yeah, we need to be looking at further devolved funds and putting officer time into that, because we're going to reap the rewards if that's the case, which shows the importance of having strong partnership links with the TVCA. I think that's really important that we develop that, right? If you look at 3.16 and 3.15, we're looking at the amount of positivity, I would say, in terms of the difference in the areas between Hartlepool and the Tees Valley. And the optimism in Tees Valley was 89% from businesses, compared with Hartlepool at 70%. And that just said to me, that's why we need to progress the town deal funding and the partnership and put that money, the business support fund money, into local businesses, develop. You said there's 500,000 on there. There's a 40-60% split. And I think it's imperative that we just take advantage, as it was highlighted, to support local businesses to sort of regenerate the economy. Because if we don't do that, or should I say, we need to do that to increase the optimism from the 70% in Hartlepool for positivity, right? Just give us a minute. So lots to read through, and I made a few notes, but I'm flapping backwards and forwards through them. Yeah, in terms of 3.46 on page 12, which is organisational change and resilience, I think this is something what we're addressing or aiming to address. It is important when we're working from home that we're supporting individual workers, but the key to this is to get the best out of them by still having that conversation, whether it be on Teams, because you can feel isolated working at home. I know my son and daughter both work from home for 18 weeks now, and I'm feeling on some of the feedback you get, it's easy to be isolated even though you're on Teams, because you miss that little one-to-one interaction, the body language and such like. And I think we really need to be on the ball with ensuring we're safeguarding the staff to get the best out of them, because also it's more difficult to challenge when you're not face to face, or it's easier to avoid situations. And I think if we're going to take this forward to be really professional about it, we need to be engaging with and getting the best out of our officers, but also reassuring them that we're confident in their ability to get the job done. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Lindridge. Councillor Tennant.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, first of all, I just want to commend officers and many of the partners in putting together this recovery plan, which I will admit is incredibly in depth and has been, and it's very detailed, which I'm very, very pleased to see. I will also just want to highlight a couple of things. First of all, I was very, very pleased with the way the council disseminated information throughout the COVID crisis. We have been very, very good at getting information out to residents across the borough, and I'm pleased to see that has been recognised in here. I do understand the queries about the use of masks and so on and how it will be enforced, and obviously that's something that will have to be looked at going forward. But I am pleased to see that workforce people are being engaged in potential idea that we could continue with some of the practices that have been adopted during the COVID situation. But I'm a little disappointed in the responses to that survey, which is 36.2% of the workforce. I would actually urge that all workforce are to be taken into account and ask them to be really engage more, so we get a bigger picture of this, so we deliver the best practices going forward. So on top of all of that, it's great to see that a lot of things have been looked at in detail, but I don't want us to get too bogged down into too much detail, because the time is of the essence to get as much new practices in place as possible. So I just wanted to make that point. So great to see lots being done, but let's actually move forward and get things in place as quickly as we can, and let's do it right.
Thank you, Councillor Tennant. I've got Councillor Little.
Hello. I totally agree with what Councillor Lindridge just said, that we have to take the welfare of our officers into account. A lot of our officers live by themselves, and or they could have a quite stressful job where driving to work could give them the all het up, or driving home could calm the temper down going home. I think a Teams meeting on a regular basis should be a priority of all managers. I know some of the teams now are really, really stressed out with what's happening with COVID and everything, and I'm looking at Kieran when I'm saying this, so hopefully he'll give his team a lot more, but I would appreciate if you could do that by Teams, Kieran, because a lot of your officers are still working from home there, and I would really appreciate if you could do that for me. We get more out of our workforce as well, because they're not having that half an hour drive into work, and they might leave at 7:30 every morning, so they might be getting up at the same time, so we might be getting extra hours out of our officers, and I think that should be noted as well. And the voluntary sector, when we've been delivering the COVID leaflets again this week, a lot of these voluntary sectors know of people that we might not know of. If we could compile a sheet of how people like the Men's Shed might have a few people that we don't know of. I'm picking on Men's Shed because we've had lots of conversations this week with gentlemen. If they might not know of other organisations that are going on.
So you might be accused of something, careful.
If the Men's Shed could compile a list of places where they could go, especially because we might not know some of those residents who go there. And I think it might be a worthwhile exercise to make sure everybody singing has got a list of numbers and organisations where they may be able to get help from while things are still closed down for the pandemic. But that's quite, and they could maybe deliver them. I don't know, but that's my thoughts. People are still suffering with the pandemic and they need to be looked after. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue. Kieran, I think Kieran and Jill were wanting to respond to.
I think we should know that response. We should all support the Men's Shed, and yeah, I think we should all get on board with that, definitely.
Kieran, were you wanting to come in?
Yes, thank you, Chair. It was just to reassure Councillor Little and members that all managers are in regular contact with team members, and we are having regular team meetings via Teams to keep contact where that it is stressful, and we don't want staff to feel isolated.
And Jill?
Thank you, Chair. It was just to make some comments before we continue the dialogue, otherwise I'll forget some of the points that have been made, although I can see some members have still got their hand up. Obviously, I mean, Councillor Little, you've mentioned the need to work closely with the voluntary and community sector. I'd also like to place on record the fact that I think our support hub has done an incredible piece of work in coordinating the efforts of the voluntary and community sector and making sure that people are given know that they can ring the support hub to get advice and the kind of information that you were talking about. We're obviously putting leaflets out regularly to remind people of that in terms of comms, but the support hub, I think, is an example of how a service change that happened through COVID might be, we need to look at ways in which we sustain that going forward in terms of new service models, which leads me to the point that just to clarify that I was making about the alternative service delivery model question. I think we've got a piece of work to do to work through what our new services will be, because we will never go back to business as usual. So we're not in a position to say, right, let's just do a list of services and decide which ones we should outsource at this moment, because we may need to be changing some services forever as a result of what we've learned through COVID. Once we've done that, there may be some very exciting conversations to have about alternative service delivery models, but that's why this is set out as there'll be no quick wins on that, and that this is why this is set out as a sort of longer term plan, a 3-year plan to help with that thinking and reshaping of services. So just to clarify that, there are examples of where outsourcing has led to some efficiencies, but there are also some areas where it hasn't. We just also, as you say, Councillor Young, we need to look at it systematically. Finally, just on the welfare of officers, and there's 2 further points. One is the welfare of officers. That's been a real concern to us throughout the whole crisis. Many officers have really like working from home. We've had many emails from staff saying this has really worked for them, and they would like us to think about how we take it forward into the future. But there have been others where it just hasn't worked for them. So if you're an introvert, it might work for you. If you're an extrovert, then actually you need people around you to keep you stimulated. And we have to recognise that not everybody's the same, and we do need to have a more hybrid model, which will allow people to, have the contact that they need and the opportunity to have the conversations that they need around complex projects or training or practice observation, and that's the kind of work we're working through at the moment. And finally, whilst this is a detailed report in terms of the analysis that's been done, I agree with Councillor Tennant that we need a very clear plan. And what we've tried to do is summarise the plan on a one page, which is, I think, the most important bit of the plan is chart 1 of the appendix, because what the detail demonstrates is that there's been a lot of thinking and analysis and data that's gone into coming up with that proposed plan. But the plan itself is a very simple one, which is a plan on a page, and I think it provides a framework for people to collaborate and work very quickly to deliver some of the objectives that have been set out in it. But every objective, I think, there's an evidence base behind why it's there. So I think I'll stop at that point, because I think I've covered off some of the points that have been raised so far, but I can see also, Chair, that there are some other hands still up.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. And we will need to, we've got quite a bit to go still, so we need to make progress at some point. I've got Christopher Eggers-Belcher.
Chair, many thanks. First of all, excellent report. I'll just cover 2 points. One's on the Business Support Fund, which I'm really in support of. There's 2 things. It needs to complement what we're doing around the town deal. And secondly, like, you know, businesses have been coming to me, and a lot of the businesses, we had the Townscape Heritage Fund, a lot of work around Church Street, and that's been stifled going forward because of COVID-19. So I think it's right and proper. But some of the things that we need to consider is that it must accelerate investment into that area, and things that were picked up in Townscape Heritage is there was things like some businesses couldn't go forward because they couldn't afford the basics in order to set up the business around heritage surveys. So it was just a really poor record. That's the kind of things that I would like to weave into consideration to note in order to get that investment into the area. The other item on the community fund is, firstly, I probably need to declare an interest that I work in the voluntary community sector, because I wouldn't like to be accused of doing anything in the voluntary community sector in the current climate. But the other thing is that it needs to be innovative and it needs to be new. And one of the things, picking up Sue's points, is we have picked up a lot of intelligence throughout our work responding to the pandemic, and we have a huge amount of intelligence, but an actual strategic priority of this council is to tackle loneliness and isolation, and I would like to see that a critical part, along with innovative schemes that are different than what we've ever done before, is part of that fund. So it was just really to put that on record.
Thank you, Councillor Eggers-Belcher. And I know there are other members who share some of those views, especially in relation to the community fund as well, and that we want to make sure that we don't end up just duplicating services that are already there, and schemes that we're looking to fill gaps, basically, to use the information that we have gained through this crisis and tackle the inequalities that we've been able to identify because of it. Okay, there's nobody else in, so if we move to the recommendations, they're on page 6. Are members happy to take the recommendations as they are? Is there any dissent?
I'm happy to approve.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you, Jill and Denise, for everybody who worked on that report. Next one then, item 6.1. Home to school transport concessionary seats. Is that you, Sally?
It is. Thank you, Chair. I know Kieran is also on the line, so he will ably assist me because he is the technical expert in this field. So if I just take through the headlines of the report, I think I'd want to highlight that there have been significant developments since this report was actually written, and I'll update the committee on this as I go along. It's important to highlight the Home to School Transport Guidance was actually published yesterday, so that doesn't give us a great deal of planning time for September. So the purpose of the report is to provide finance and policy with further information in relation to the provision of concession receipts on home to school transport, as requested at a meeting of Council on the 30th of July. Section 3.1 outlines the statutory responsibilities of the Council in relation to the provision of home to school transport and the categories of eligibility. The obligation on the council is to provide home to school travel assistance. This is limited to the children attending their nearest school, and the council has no obligation to make arrangements to transport non-entitled children to school. That said, in recent years, we have offered any spare seat capacity on our buses to non-entitled students for a charge under a concessionary seat arrangement. However, in January 2020, the Public Service Vehicle Accessibility Regulations, PSVAR, for the rest of the presentation, came into force, and this meant that where a seat was being charged for travel, the vehicle would need to be wheelchair accessible, amongst other things. When these regulations came into force, not all of our fleet vehicles were accessible, so the council provided places for those travelling on concessionary permits free of charge from January to July 2020. The council has actually purchased 2 replacement vehicles that are PSVAR compliant, and an update to the information at paragraph 3.4 is that we now expect delivery of the buses in late October 2020. In addition, the council is also eligible to apply for an exemption. We've clarified that recently, and an application has been submitted. The Department for Transport states they're planning to issue certificates to operators before September, which means we may now be in a slightly different position come September. So the current position is that the council is likely to be able to provide some concessionary travel permits on home to school transport, although capacity may be lower than in previous years due to the impact of COVID and the number of eligible young people. 3.7 provides a summary of the arrangements by school, and as the table shows, there's a mixed economy of provision, which is usually down to the individual school. The current challenges that we face, in particular, impact upon the English Martyrs Catholic School and Sixth Form College, as they rely on the availability of capacity of concessionary seats for a significant numbers of their pupils, who, as members will understand, will be travelling from across the town, and the details of these are provided at section 3.9. So moving into section 4, the council's been in discussion with English Martyrs to seek to work together to resolve the challenges posed by the current situation for pupils and parents. The transport team are working on the figures to seek to provide as much capacity on the buses as possible, and that will make sure that that goes as far as we can to meet the demand for concessionary seats. The PSVAR exemption and the delivery of our new vehicles will also assist with this. Just in an update to paragraph 4.3, we had proposed that because we were unable under PSVAR to charge for concessionary seats, that places would be provided free of charge. However, now that we are aware that we can apply for an exemption, and it's likely that we're eligible for that exemption, the update is that the council proposes to continue to provide concessionary travel permits and recommence charging for these as the exemption will be in place. In terms of financial considerations, the council has a statutory duty to provide home to school transport for eligible pupils, and the cost of this is met by the council. With the PSVAR exemption, the council can recommence charging for the provision of concessionary travel permits. So if I can take members to the recommendations, members of Finance and Policy Committee are asked to consider the contents of this report as requested by the meeting of Council on the 30th of July, and I would like to propose an amendment to the recommendation at 13.2 that members are asked to approve the proposal that the Council recommences charging for concessionary travel permits to the available capacity, as the Council is eligible for a PSVAR exemption. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sally. I've got Councillor Akers-Belcher.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of points, and what I would have liked to see is some element of consultation but like the report actually says under 8.1 no formal consultation has been undertaken, and Sally will know I've never really agreed on the statutory walking distance. I think we've had conversations in the past around me personally, I always think Hartlepool should be better than what the statutory walking distances are, and I would like something more in the future, more localized, because to actually expect a 4 to 7 year old to walk up to 2 miles, in secondary pupils to walk up to 3 miles, I just think personally as a parent and grandparent that is unacceptable, and I would like something in the future that for that to be reviewed. And one of the things that we could do is we should be having a conversation with the Combined Authority. They received a huge amount of money under the Transforming Cities Fund, which could be utilised for transport. And there's nothing to stop us to explore and at least having a conversation with the Combined Authority on whether or not we can look at subsidising transport, which could be, before 9 a.m. for school children and for when school finishes for an hour to get them home. And I think at least it's worth a conversation, and perhaps we need to package some element of consultation before we make a final decision. So that's my view on the report, but I just think that, had we been in a different financial position, I don't believe in charging children to get to school.
Thank you, Councillor Hayes-Belcher. You raise a good point there in relation to the TVCA. You're our representative on the TVCA Transport Committee. Have you got any meetings coming up at any point soon that you could potentially raise that?
The next meeting isn't scheduled until September, October time. So I think, perhaps we could craft a letter between us, and we could send that over to see whether or not we can arrange a separate meeting to have that conversation.
Okay, thank you. I've got Councillor Smith.
Hiya, just a couple of questions. One of them, I'm looking at 3.7, where it says Dykehouse 6 buses, 17 eligible students, 268 non-eligible students. Now, Dykehouse is a school for Seaton residents, so why, and it's more than 3 miles away, so why is there so many non-eligible students?
Is Kieran or Sally best to answer that one?
I'll give Kieran a go, but I can come in if need be.
Yeah, I'll take that one, Chair. It's because the Dykehouse won't be the closest school to Seaton itself, so it will be non-eligible in that sense. And
so, which school would you have said is the closest school? Would it be
Manor?
Manor School, right? Okay, doke. But even though that is Dykehouse is a feeder school for Seaton, it's not. We don't have a choice. It's that it would be an extra. So it would be a parent's choice not to send it to a feeder school. So why doesn't the councils line up with those? Why do we have a different set of rules to feeder schools?
Probably most helpful if I come in at that point, Chair. So we have a cluster model in the town with our feeder schools and our secondary schools, and that's how they're configured. The school admissions brochure very clearly does advise around eligibility for school transport. We now moved into a place around school choice, and parents now have a choice of which school they send their children to, and that's where the statutory guidance refers to the nearest school, and the nearest school is different potentially from the feeder schools, but that's an arrangement that's made between the schools. And I know that Dykehouse does actually sort of work with its feeder primaries to support children to attend their school, but the actual issue is the nearest primary school, the nearest secondary school is Manor. but parents don't always realise the impact of their parental choice of secondary school in terms of their eligibility for home to school transport, but it is covered in the admissions brochure.
Thank you. I do have just one or two. Fair Law is going to be finishing soon. Do we have any sort of backup plan in regards to the amount of children that are then going to be entitled to be able to get free school transport? Is it just like a guessing game at the moment where, you know, we're estimating this amount or we're not estimating anything? Have we got any sort of idea how many children we think might go on and what sort of time scale are we looking at?
Did this report not go to Children's Services before it came here? Can I just ask that question?
No, the information didn't. Next time, can you raise your hand, please, Councillor Young? Kieran or Sally, who's best to answer that one?
Kieran.
Sorry, can we repeat the question, please?
So Fair Law is going to be finishing soon. Government stopping Fair Law soon. So we know that, well, we don't know, but we believe that there'll be people who will then become unemployed and their children will then be entitled to free school transport. So have we already made a judgment of how many people we think we were going? Have we purchased things on what we know now? What sort of contingency plan do we have in place?
Thank you. Yes, it's an impossible task at the moment to try and put figures to the numbers. What I will try and offer some comfort is we always do hold back some capacity on the buses. We don't sell every seat. We hold some back because I mean, we still haven't got all the applications in, we suspect, for children who were eligible last year to get going forward. One of the other options we've got is we've got our buses. Our new buses are coming. So we'll have some spare capacity there, assuming the exemption certificate comes through as expected. We will be able to hold some of those buses back in the short term to give us some additional capacity should it be needed.
And my last one, I do apologise, you know, too many questions in one go. The disability access for the buses. I remember Councillor or James Black speaking about it quite some time ago. Saying that, you know, we need to make action, purchase the buses, be able. Why have we left it till last minute, and now we're not going to have? So I know COVID doesn't help, but now we're not going to actually have the buses in time. Why have we left it so long?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. Yeah, it was originally a thought that school transport was exempt from the PSVAR regulations. As it came to light right at the last minute that no, this was not the case. So we purchased our buses, which were due to be with us June, July time, to allow us to start charging from there. We've been lobbying the government, as has every other local authority, for clarity on this, and the exemption has now come forward that we are exempt for a year.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I've got Councillor Harrison.
Thanks, Chair. Just to say, first of all, that I very much appreciate the work that's been done by Sally and her team to try and get things up and going for September. And I know it's a very difficult task because of all the unknowns. But I think the collaboration with the schools is key, which I know they've done, and I do appreciate that. Having said that, I totally agree with what Christopher said earlier on about, you know, kids should not have to pay to go to school. And I also agree with the 3 mile and the 2 mile business, because I do think it's expecting an awful lot of our young people to be walking so far there and back. And I know it's all, you know, the health thing is one thing, but Hartlepool winters are not known to be favourable, and it really does. Well, I don't think it's a good thing at all. And I know that that's not a Hartlepool thing. I know it's a national thing. So I would appreciate the opportunity at a further stage in the future to look a little bit more closely at what we can do to help this situation, because I don't think it's a good situation as it is. I think a lot of families in the town are struggling normally with homeschool travel, and I do think that we need to do something a little bit more robust about it. The idea of getting some help from TVCA seems to be a very good one, and to look into that a bit further would be great. So I just wanted to express my views about that, and thank you very much.
Sally, were you wanting to come back on that?
Just very briefly, it would be remiss of me not to recognise. Thank you, Councillor Harrison, and I appreciate the thanks you've offered for my team. It's important that we recognise the work of Kieran's team and Jane Brown as well. It's just be remiss of me not to highlight that.
Sorry, Kieran. I didn't realise it was all separate. Sorry.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Tennant.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question with regard to the table of 3.7. It does point out that the number of buses procured by the school for Dyke House is 6 buses, with none from HPC. And English Martins don't procure any buses, and we provide 3. With what appears to be a similar proportion with regards to eligible students and non-eligible. Can I ask why that is the case on the one hand? And on the other hand, with regard to the discussion on support from TVCA, that's something I've actually been raising behind the scenes on a number of occasions over the last year. So I'm glad to hear that there's been some movement on that.
Thank you. Kieran?
Yeah, the procurement of the services from Dyke House, that's a commercial decision that's been undertaken by the school to provide transport to all pupils. All schools are free to offer that service, but obviously they have to budget for that themselves.
Thank you, Kieran.
Sorry, Chair, can I come back on that?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I was just wondering why. The question is not necessarily budget-wise, but why is it English Martins choose not to provide school buses when, you know, they've got 3 schools there that do?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Tennant. It's not for me to comment on individual commercial decisions from the school. That's something that the school would have to pick up themselves.
Okay, no worries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. One question from me, Kieran, and it came from a discussion I had earlier today. If obviously there will be an impact on now that the extension's been granted for 11 months of the PAS. Yeah, what is it? PAS. That's the one. Yeah, everyone knows what I'm talking about. But there will still probably be an impact in certain areas where some kids, there won't be those places on the buses, whether they can pay for them or not. And just out of interest, have we ever had any discussion with the Combined Authority in relation to the Tees Flex bus service to see about potentially utilising their service bus between the kind of hours of 8 and 9, just, you know, as the on-demand service? Because surely it would help their business case as well. Yeah, and I just wonder if any discussions ever been had in relation to that.
No discussions have been had, Chair, but it was certainly something that I was going to pick up on the back of Councillor Akers-Belcher's comments.
Okay. Sally?
Thank you, Chair. I can just say not from a work-related perspective, but from a personal perspective, living in Stockton, I find myself hit by PSVAR as well. They are actually looking at the Tees Flex buses supporting that, so that might be something that we could explore in Hartlepool as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the recommendations then, obviously the changed slightly because of the amendment Sally made to the one detailed earlier on. So with the changed recommendation, are members happy to support? I've got Councillor Akers-Belcher with his hand up.
Chair, it's just like based on our previous points, I would like something where the committee is going to agree picking up like, what both myself and Brenda have mentioned about a more localized view, and whether or not that can be done as part of the budget considerations, that we're going to have a look at a more local scheme where we don't expect our children to walk either 2 miles or 3 miles. But with regards to the recommendation, like, at the present time, like, the way that a lot of families are in crisis, I couldn't support, like, the reintroduction of charges for children to get to school.
Okay, so we'll need to take a vote on the right. So is there any dissent on the first recommendation, 13.1? Councillor Lindridge? Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. How do I put this across? Councillor Tennant raised the situation there where his question wasn't answered, and you actually said, Kieran actually said he couldn't comment on a response for individual schools. Yeah. First of all, I agree that there shouldn't be charges for young people, well, not for the young people, for the adults that's getting the kids to school. And we do need to explore links with Tees Valley for further funding opportunities. Yeah. However, I look at this at a different perspective and think that if Dyke House has spent funds on 6 buses, right, they're taking that out of their budget. So this is an example. That means that the funding, let's say it was £50,000 or whatever it may be, English Martyrs are not taking that out, which means they've got another £50,000 to spend on the students in that school and making further provision. So to me, that disadvantaged Dyke House to taking money out of the pot, which could be spent on other facilities in the school and the students and such like. So I think there's an anomaly there. It does need to be right across the board, and you can't have some schools sort of not given the obligation or passing it on to parents to pay them funding. So I'd just like to make that point. It needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I think you made a good point, Councillor Lindridge. But then I guess the flip side of that is if individual schools have to make that choice and balance their budget to decide whether they're going to spend, as the sum you mentioned, £50,000 on making sure the kids get to school, or £50,000 on new books or whatever else, that's a decision. If you take that away, that's a decision we're going to have to make, because we'd have to pick up the shortfall. And then the question, of course, is what other service do we disadvantage to pick that up? But I'll bring Chris in to just go over the financial implications.
Thanks.
I think to some extent, Chair, you've probably covered them there, and I think Councillor Lindridge's, the comments were helpful as well in terms of one aspect. As you said, the flip side is if members made a decision, you'd shift the cost from the schools for some of the pupils onto the council, which is the very point you've made. I think Sally's probably got a better handle on actually the detailed finance. I don't know whether she needs to say anything to help support that, but the general principle is, we've got a current arrangement that's operated, and there's a certain arrangement that's budgeted for. Any changes to that put pressure on the council's budget, as we've already alluded to today. We've got huge financial challenges that the council faces already. I can understand members' comments about the distance the children walk, but to some extent we're also, we've got the issue of, there are national guidelines and national regulations, and the funding system doesn't recognise authorities deviating from that, unless the authority locally is determined to pick up the costs. And I think, as you've made the point, we're not funded if we deviate effectively. It's then a local choice about, well, you can have more of that but less of something else. And I think you'd need to make those decisions in the round, rather than look at one issue in isolation.
Sorry, Chair, I just need to get a parcel from the front door if there's any votes. Just give me 30 seconds, please.
Right, okay. Sally, will you want to come in on that?
Yes, so I suppose my point was that we previously charged for concessionary travel permits. We only ceased to charge for them when we were no longer able to. So that was between January and July. So this is for non-eligible pupils. So the issue of the charge is an income that comes into the council that we had lost. I don't think we're moving into a realm of providing. school transport for a wider cohort of children. I think we're talking about those who use concessionary travel permits, and we're charging those pupils. We can commence recharging those pupils. That's the critical issue I think that members are asking me to make a decision on today, in the context then of the wider comments from Councillor Akers-Belcher and Councillor Harrison to explore alternative opportunities as well, if that's helpful.
Thank you, Kieran.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to draw members' attention to the fact that Dyke House procure the service directly to us as on the commercial arm of the council. They would be free to use any other coach company within the region, but they come to us to procure that service. So any decision that would not introduce that charge would potentially put that contract at risk as well.
Thank you. Okay, I've got Councillor Harrison, and then we're going to need to make some movement on this, so we'll need to go to the recommendations.
Thanks, Chair. Just very quickly, I would agree totally with what Sally has just said, but also to look forward for other things in the future. But just to answer the question about why the difference in approach to schools, I would imagine that there is a big difference between the academies that those schools are involved in, and the academy will have probably a lot more financial help to give to some than to others.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll need to look. It sounds like we're going to need to vote on the recommendations as they are then. So if we look at recommendation 13.1, was there any dissent on that one, or will we need to go to a vote? There's no dissent. Okay, thank you. So 13.2, the proposal was to amend that to reintroduce concessionary costs, to sell the spare concessionary travel permits as detailed by Sally earlier. There's some members have obviously indicated that they're not happy with that, so I think David will need to vote on this one. So I guess it's a vote either in favour of the current recommendation or the altered recommendation, sorry.
So just to be clear, Chair.
Yeah, Sally, would you just mind confirming what the altered recommendation is, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the alters members are asked to approve the proposal that the Council recommences charging for concessionary travel permits to the available capacity as the Council is eligible for a PSVAR exemption.
Thank you.
Okay, members, I'll go through the vote. So it's for, against, or abstaining on that amended recommendation. Councillor Christopher Akers-Belcher.
Against.
Councillor Brewer.
For.
Councillor Brown.
Sorry, Chair, can I just clarify? Have we made an amendment that says we're going to look into the 2 mile, 3 mile distance that Brenda and Christopher were referring to, or?
No, that will be separate again.
Yeah,
that'll be a separate report, Councillor Brown.
Okay. Well, I'm for, as long as we're going to review that at a later stage.
Thank you.
Councillor Harrison.
Yes, similarly, for at this present time.
Councillor Lindridge.
For.
Councillor Little.
For.
Councillor Marshall.
For.
Councillor Moore.
For.
Councillor Smith.
For.
Councillor Tennant.
For.
Councillor Young.
Didn't hear you there, Councillor Young.
Councillor Young.
He's nodded off.
Just give him a second. Councillor Young, are you still there?
It looks like the screen's frozen, doesn't it? So it might be his internet.
What a time to cut out.
No. Mike, are you able to use the chat function? For the record, Councillor Young has just entered the room to say 4.
Thank you, Councillor. That's carried, Chair.
Thank you. Okay. Next item then is item 6.2, proposed appointment of assistant coroner. Neil, are you taking this one?
Yes, thank you, Chair. The purpose of this report is to seek agreement to the proposed appointment of the assistant coroner by Middlesbrough Council. The background to this report is contained in section 3, and that largely shows that the Teesside and Hartlepool Coroner's Service is the busiest in the North East in 2019, having 3,013 deaths been reported and 395 inquests. This year, of course, will be impacted significantly by the COVID-19 outbreak, and the expectation that deaths and inquests will increase considerably. To compound matters further, the COVID-19 lockdown has resulted in inquest hearings not being able to proceed, and therefore there is now a backlog of inquest waiting. The Chief Coroner suggests that most coronial services require 6 assistant coroners, and our service has only 2 active assistant coroners. Members will recall that the coronial services were merged back in 2018, and Middlesbrough therefore is the relevant local authority for the purposes of making these decisions. Middlesbrough Council does, of course, have a duty to consult with us, and is doing so. Ordinarily, it would be necessary for an open competition to take place for the appointment of an assistant coroner. However, the Chief Coroner recently gave amended guidance to allow direct appointments, primarily to deal with situations such as this, and to allow coronial services to deal with the increase in workload. I can confirm that Stockton, Redcar and Middlesbrough are all in agreement with the proposal to appoint a further assistant coroner, and the costs that would be associated with this to Hartlepool would be £3,000 per annum. There is a possibility that for this year may be covered with the COVID-19 costs. However, this would be a budget pressure in future years. Essentially, that is the purpose of the report, to allow the coronial service to deal with the backlog and discharge its functions efficiently, so that the proposal and the recommendation of the report is that agreement is given to the appointment of a further assistant coroner. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Are there any questions or comments from members? No. Okay. So we'll look at the recommendation then. Are all in agreement to the recommendation that the council appoints the assistant coroner for the Teesside and Hartlepool Coroner Service? Is there any dissent?
Agreed.
Okay. Thank you, members. We move to 7.1, provision of accommodation and homelessness in rough sleeping during COVID-19.
Thank you, Chair. That will be me. So this report is to provide finance and policy with further information regarding the provision of accommodation for those who were homeless and rough sleeping during the COVID-19 response, as requested at the meeting of Finance and Policy Committee on the 29th of June. On the 26th of March 2020, the Minister for Local Government and Homelessness wrote to all local authority chief executives outlining the council's response to COVID-19 and rough sleeping to help make sure that everyone was brought in off the streets to protect their health and stop the wider transmission of the virus. The letter advised that it was imperative that rough sleepers and other vulnerable homeless are supported into appropriate accommodation by the end of the week in which the letter was issued. In the context of this requirement, the Council's Strategic Coordinating Group agreed that action was urgently required to mobilise accommodation for those who are identified as rough sleeping and/or homeless. In the light of the communication from the Minister and the timescale set, there was no time to test the market or tender for accommodation providers. Bed and breakfast and hotel accommodation were closed under government guidance, and there are several premises in the town that do not accept referrals from Hartlepool Borough Council. There was limited capacity in our commission providers of supported accommodation to meet the needs of rough sleeping or homeless individuals, and therefore it was necessary to identify additional provision that would support those who were homeless or rough sleeping. Moving on to section 4, following the ministerial announcement, an approach was made to Families First North East, an organisation that was in the process of developing supported accommodation for young adults at the Melbourne Hotel. At that time, the accommodation was vacant and could be mobilised to provide accommodation, staffing and support within 24 to 48 hours, which aligned with the timescale set by the government. The arrangement with the Melbourne Hotel was for the provision of 6 rooms available 24 hours a day and for the provision of support alongside accommodation. A one-off set-up cost was provided for and a weekly fee agreed. Paragraph 4.3 outlines the support services that were provided by Melbourne Hotel for those residents who were referred to and stayed at the premises. During the period 27th of March to 8th of June, a total of 73 homeless people were recorded by the Housing Advice Team. Over the same period, 8 single people and 1 family were referred to the Melbourne Hotel. Of the remaining clients who sought advice from the Housing Support Team, the majority were either supported into short-term leases, provided with accommodation through other commission services, or were supported to stay with family and friends. Moving on to section 6, the cost of provision of the temporary supported accommodation at the Melbourne Hotel was £57,613, and the vast majority of this cost arose from the provision of 24-hour staffing arrangements, which enabled those who were referred to receive an appropriate level of support and guidance, and also that the service was available to receive referrals on both evenings and weekends to immediately respond to those found to be homeless or rough sleeping. All the costs were covered from the government grant funding provided to the council specifically to cover the costs associated with the COVID-19 response. There are no ongoing costs associated with the provision at Melbourne House. So the recommendation for members is for members of the committee are asked to note the contents of this report, which provides additional information on the urgent decision taken in response to the COVID-19 to fund accommodation to support those who were rough sleeping and/or homeless. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sally. That's third time lucky. I have Councillor Harrison wanting to speak.
Thanks. Just a question, Sally. It says at 4.4 that there was a total of 73 homeless people recorded at the Housing Advice Team. Now, not long before lockdown, we were looking at this issue as one of our issues at the time in the Audit and Governance Committee. And I'm sure the number then was in its 30s. So I'm not quite sure where 73 has come from. Can you give us a bit more detail on that?
I could try, Councillor Harrison. So that's over that total period of time, so between the 27th of March and the 8th of June. So those are the number of contacts made with our housing advice team where people were advising that they were having some accommodation difficulties. So not all those people would have been presenting as immediately homeward. Right. Their tenancies would be at risk, for example.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
It does, yes, thanks very much. Can I just say that I think, you know, the work that's been done to help the homeless has been fantastic as a response to the COVID outbreak. I would only hope that we can continue that. I know it comes at a cost, and I know there are implications, but the actual idea of keeping people off the street as much as possible is very good. I am aware, having gone to Morrison's a couple of times now, that there are people back on the street and begging again outside Morrison's. And I think it would be just great if we could help those people all together. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Harrison. I have Councillor Little.
My thoughts were on the 73 is that some of these people might have been sofa surfing. I don't know whether that's being taken, like if you include them into your figures. And when I've spoken to the team before, the homeless team before, they said there's a lot of homeless people don't identify themselves to the council. They're either living in, they're either living in, it's Grace. She's been really quiet all the way through, but she's just decided to start singing. They haven't identified themselves to the council, i.e. they're either living in farmers' fields, back of school fields and that. Do you think that's where you've got the 73 where it's jumped up so high? Do you think that's where some of these people might have come from?
So if I may come back in, as I say, I think it will be people who've presented with not necessarily immediately homeless at that day, I have nowhere to sleep tonight, but their tenancy being at risk. In terms of those who are potentially sleeping other places, we do rough sleeper sweeps. So Cornerstone, which is a VCS organisation, works with us and do spend time at certain times of the day looking to identify people who are potentially rough sleeping and have conversations with them. It is fair to say that there are individuals who do present on the street. Those individuals are not necessarily homeless. Many of them do have accommodation but choose to spend time during the day on the streets, but they actually do have accommodation to return to at night.
Thank you, Sally. Councillor Akers-Belcher.
Sorry, Chair. Just a couple of questions. Sally, when you introduced the report, you referred to 4.4 and you said there was 8 people over the period and the 73 homeless people recorded with Housing Advice Team, but it says 4 single males and 1 single female and 1 family. So I'm just wondering, does the 8 mean it was a family of 2, to make the total in 8? And may I ask, for what period over the length of the contract were each of those people in the Melbourne house?
Okay.
I've got a couple of more questions, if that's okay.
So thank you, Councillor. That's my shocking mathematics and my misread of the report. You are correct. It is 5 single people and 1 family. In terms of the length of time of the period that they're in the accommodation, I don't have that information to hand, but I will get it and provide it to members of the committee.
Okay. My other question was that we already have a contract working with Cornerstone and the Home Group, and we constantly work with the Home Group around homelessness. In hindsight, would the Home Group not have been able to accommodate these people, bearing in mind the numbers are so low? And I know if you pro-rata it over the length of the contract, it seems quite low, but if you're talking about 5 people and a family, per family or individual, the cost is very, very high. And so I just wonder why Cornerstone and why the Home Group couldn't have accommodated. And I know from experience speaking to people that the Melbourne refused to accept some of our referrals, and we ended up putting them in B&Bs anyway. So there may have been a cost of over 50,000 for the Melbourne, but there was an additional cost on the council for all the ones that the Melbourne wouldn't take, and we had to put in B&B anyway.
Thank you, Councillor Akers-Belcher. So in terms of Cornerstone and Home Group, you're right, we do work very closely with those organisations, and we are actually delivering a housing presentation at the members' briefing next week to talk about some of the wider housing issues and our partners in that. In terms of approaching those, what we were asked to do in the ministerial letter was look to additional capacity. At that time, we didn't have a sense of what the level of need was going to be. So in a very short period of time, we were asked to mobilise additional capacity, and this was an opportunity that we thought could be available to support the level of need. So I think we didn't cease to use either Home Group or Cornerstone. We just knew there was an opportunity to have some additional capacity should this be required within a very short time frame within which we were being required to take immediate action.
Okay, thank you for that. I've just got one other thing, but if I can receive those figures about, like, you know, the tenure, how long each person was in for that period. And the last thing is, it's just that some of the residents have asked us to raise one issue, and they've been in contact with the council with regards to the occupancy at the Melbourne House, and the response that they got back from the council over the antisocial behaviour happening at the premises was an officer told them that they couldn't do anything around antisocial behaviour because it is a business at Melbourne House. And I just believe that we have a moral duty, if we support on premises, that we need to be a good neighbour. And what I don't like is, it's not even my ward, but I'm getting enquiries because I work in the voluntary community sector. And, like, you know, people are putting complaints in, and the response from our own teams is we can't do anything to address it when, like, there's people outside of the building the early hours of the morning, like, you know, causing antisocial behaviour and lights on, and it's just not good. And I would just ask if someone, like, you know, if we are going to use the premises in the future, that there can be good liaison between the community safety team and whoever is commissioning that service, because what I don't like is the fact that the reputation of the council is being affected because of the antisocial behaviour that's occurring at those premises.
I think, Denise, were you wanting to respond, or are you able to respond to that?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's disappointing that that response has been given, I think, Councillor Akers-Belcher, and if we have the details of that, I'm more than happy to take that forward and work with the community safety team. But if we can have that, then that we would, because we do have a responsibility, as do the police, for any antisocial behaviour. So I would always encourage residents to actually ring the police as well if they're suffering from antisocial behaviour in the middle of the morning.
Thank you. Councillor Lindridge, and then we'll need to move on.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, one homeless person's too much, never mind 73. We do have a duty of care there, and I think the Melbourne is an important additional resource to Hartlepool Borough Council in reducing homelessness. In relation to, it's been picked up because one of my questions was, what is the average length of stay with a resident, if you call them a resident or a family, but that's been picked up earlier. In relation to the SB, I think it is important to note that we haven't got to be sort of targeting a particular hotel or accommodation. If there's issues with the SB, that should be raised with residents wherever they are in the town, you know, and if it is a problem, that should be reported. If it hasn't been reported, we can't do anything about it. So as Denise said, it's right, we should link in with the antisocial behaviour team, and that should be picked up as part of our strategy duty. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Okay. Our members, yeah, that's everybody then. Okay. So members, you're being asked just to note the content, obviously with the additional requests that have been made by Councillor Akers-Belcher. Are we happy to note that and move on to the next? Thank you. So the next one, 7.2, provision of food during COVID-19 response. Director of Adult and Community-Based Services.
Thank you, Chair.
Similar to the last report, the purpose of this report is to provide the Finance and Policy Committee with further information following a request at this meeting on the 29th of June in relation to the provision of food during the COVID-19 response. Section 3 sets out the background and the context to this. People will be aware that obviously in the early stages of COVID-19, there were significant issues in accessing food and household essentials with panic buying and difficulty for people accessing supplies. Those difficulties were a particular challenge for those who were clinically vulnerable or had been advised to self-isolate. And local authorities were instructed to establish shielding hubs, which was to support those covered by the shielding guidance particularly, but also recognised that there were a significant number of other people who also required substantial support to access food in particular, but also to access medication. So Section 4 sets out how we address this in Hartlepool. We obviously established the support hub at very short notice in the early weeks of the COVID response, and as well as providing access to food, we've used that support hub model to provide people with advice and information, emotional support, links to befriending services, prescriptions, continence products, hearing aid batteries, and the list goes on. It was very much a responsive service that adapted to meet the needs that were identified. The initial response in relation to food was emergency food parcels, which were provided in partnership with Hartlepool Food Bank. And they were given to people who contacted the support hub, particularly if we couldn't provide them with anything different over a weekend. And we knew that that would support people in the short term for 2 to 3 days while we looked at longer term options. It quickly became apparent that we needed to look at a more sustainable option for people who had a need in the sort of medium to long term. And that's when we commissioned the weekly food boxes. This enabled us to provide people with a wider range of food, including fresh produce, so bread, milk, fresh fruit and vegetables, meat. So we enabled people to have a healthier diet and access to a broader range of food than we could supply through the emergency parcels. We did some work with other partner organisations and some benchmarking with another council that took a similar approach and managed to procure this at a lower cost for Hartlepool. The provision was reviewed on a weekly basis and we reduced the number of weekly food parcels that was needed as we went forward and actually ceased the requirement for the service 2 weeks earlier than we initially anticipated because lockdown measures were being restricted and being lifted and people were able to access food more easily. A total of 1,900 weekly food boxes were provided at an average cost of £38.40 per box. 887 individuals and families benefited from this, with 442 of the food boxes distributed to people aged over 60. We also used the weekly food boxes to support families in crisis that were identified through schools and through social workers in children's services. We didn't look at provision of hot food as a priority initially, but as the COVID response progressed, we were approached by Mecca Bingo and worked in partnership with them to provide hot meals that were delivered through the support hub infrastructure to people who predominantly would have accessed day services or lunch clubs and weren't able to do so because of the lockdown restrictions. So it was very much a replacement service rather than something that created a dependency for people. And over 2,800 hot meals were delivered through that partnership working with Mecca Bingo. In addition to that, there was the National Food Box Scheme run by the government. When people were identified as requiring to be on the shielded list, they were given the option of signing up to the National Food Box Scheme, which again was a weekly food delivery. And we supported that through the support hub. So, for example, if people were receiving a food delivery, but maybe had a disability or a frailty that meant they couldn't physically get the box into their property or they needed additional support, we also provided that through the support hub. We were required nationally to develop food provision options for people who had particular dietary needs. which we did through developing gluten-free, vegetarian, diabetic and halal options. And that was something that wasn't available through the national scheme, which was just a standard weekly food box that obviously couldn't meet the needs of all individuals. And there's some examples in section 5 of some of the feedback that we received from people who were supported through the hub, and particularly in relation to food. Some of these comments have already been shared through the weekly newsletters and press releases. And obviously, as you'll see from that, we had an overwhelmingly positive response from people who've been supported. We're now working with all of those people as shielding has come to an end to look at whether they have any ongoing residual needs and whether we can provide ongoing support through the support hub model. So, for example, that includes helping people to access priority slots for online shopping through the supermarkets, but also continuing that emotional support, befriending and initiatives to tackle social isolation. So we now have lots of online activities that people are accessing as well. In terms of the cost, that's set out in section 7.1, and all costs have been covered from the funding provided to the council specifically for the COVID-19 response, and there are no ongoing costs associated with any elements of the response that we provided. The recommendation in the report is that Finance and Policy Committee note the information that's been provided. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Jill. And thank you to everybody in the support who did a fantastic job during this period. Councillor Young.
Yeah, I think that's a really good report. It clears up quite a lot of the points that were raised out of a lack of knowledge last meeting. I do have one question, which is around the kind of allocation of funding, and I don't want you to answer it now, Jill. I think it's probably something we can do separately. So are you happy to have a meeting with me and we'll go through that ourselves? Is that okay with you?
Yes, that's no problem at all.
Thank you. And Councillor Harrison?
Yeah, just to echo what a fantastic job has been done by whoever, I'll just say whoever's been involved throughout the council and wider community over this period. Again, some of the things highlighted are things that we can carry on with, particularly from the social isolation point of view. And, you know, the good work that's been done shouldn't just stop suddenly. Mind, I don't think this is ever going to go away, but you know, if it ever does go away, it shouldn't just stop suddenly. It should continue, particularly I think with the social isolation side of things. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Harrison. Okay, if there's nobody else, then the members happy to note the report and for us to carry on. Okay. Great.
I think Jim had his hand up.
No.
Sorry, yeah, I'm just okay, Chair.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't see your hand up.
Reiterating what Councillor Harrison's just said, I just think I'd like to praise the fantastic provision we've made as a council in the food provision and the partnership we went with the food bank and the hubs. It's reducing the social isolation, and I actually think it's strengthening community ties with the vulnerable and the needy people. So to me, the financial amount there becomes negligible in terms of the 15,000 for the food bank and the purchase of the food boxes, because that would be 2, 3, 4, 10-fold more than that if those residents or those needy residents couldn't access that. The demand on other services within the town, you know, and on the council as well, would be immense. So I think we should be patting ourselves on the back. And I know there's two councillors in particular that's been given food boxes out, Councillor Smith and Little, and I feel quite humble in thinking I'm glad I'm not in that situation, but it's great that we have councillors making a separate effort themselves, put themselves out to pack boxes up and give them to the needy. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Lindridge. Jill, will you want to come back in? You've got your hand up.
Just wanted to thank members really for the positive feedback. I'll make sure that's passed on to the team. It was very much a team effort, the support hub. We had an awful lot of staff who were doing a very different day job to what they were used to doing, who adapted very quickly and provided a fantastic service. And as ever with our staff, lots of people going the extra mile. One of my favourite bits of feedback was the man who got sent his 70th birthday card through the hub, and it was the only birthday card he got, I think, that year. So, you know, some of the stories and some of the learning from how we've operated the hub are really important. And I just wanted to reassure members really that it's absolutely our intention to continue with all of the positive things that have been delivered through the hub. We're looking at how we can build on that and how we can take that forward. And although shielding's officially stopped, the work of the support hub absolutely hasn't stopped. That continues, and we're just obviously in the process of getting that leaflet out to all households to remind them that the hub is still there. So we'd very much encourage members to get the message out to people and to encourage people to contact the hub if they are still in need of support. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Okay, are members happy then to note the report? Yeah,
agreed.
Great, thank you. Last agenda item then, 7.3 corporate procurement quarterly report on contracts. Chris. Oh no, Neil.
No, it's me, thanks. Thank you, Chair. Yes, this is the procurement quarterly report. The contract procedure rules in part 4 of the Constitution require that the information that's referred to in paragraph 3.1 of this report is referred to this committee. Now, all of the required information is contained within the tables in annexes A, B and C, and I would therefore welcome any questions that any member may have, but would of course point out that the contents of Annex C are commercially sensitive, and therefore we would need to go into closed session if there were any questions specifically in relation to that.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments from members on any of those contracts? No. Okay. In that case, then, members happy to note the content of that report. Agreed?
Agreed.
Great. Thank you. And that is it then. There are no other items to bring forward. I'll just thank you all very much. And the next meeting, although unless we call another one, is the Monday, the 21st of September. Thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yes.